Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Blue Marine Foundation, welcome to this afternoon's Whelk Symposium. I'm Sam Fanshawe. I'm UK Projects Manager with Blue Marine, and I'm delighted to see that we'll have maybe up to 80 people joining us this afternoon to share current knowledge and support ongoing work to safeguard the long-term health of UK whelk populations and sustainable fisheries. We've got lots to cover, and so we'll do our best to stick to time, especially given that it's a bit of a hot day, and for some of you, especially if you're based in the southeast, might be needing to get away for some cool off time later this evening. So just firstly to welcome you, that'll be the first and only pun today, welcome you to this event and just run through with you a few things which will hopefully help everyone get the most out of it. Firstly, the session is being recorded and we started recording, and we'll be able to share that publicly after the event. You'll automatically get a link to that as soon as it's available. We are in a Zoom webinar, so that means your video and mic have been turned off throughout the event. So please write any questions that you have to speakers in the Q&A box, which is in the bottom of your Zoom command bar. You can also vote for questions of particular interest to you by selecting the like button alongside the questions that pop up. And Jacob Ashton from Mindfully Wired Communications will be hosting the Q&A sessions at the end of each of the three sessions and will present the questions to the speaker panel. And if you'd like to run through your question yourself, you can unmute at that time and ask your question verbally, or if you'd prefer, Jacob can read out the question for you. During the open forum sessions, please use the raise hand function, which is also at the bottom of the Zoom command bar. And when the chair invites you to speak, please remember to unmute. And we've got a great team behind us with Paul, Becky and Jacob from Mindfully Wired Communications this afternoon. They'll be there to answer any questions that you might have. So why whelk? I'm sure you've all got one or many reasons why you've joined us today. And recent events such as our departure from the EU and conflict in Eastern Europe have had really quite significant repercussions for regional and global markets for seafood, including whelk, which have directly or indirectly impacted the UK whelk fishery. And these are really highly important issues for our UK fishing industry, and they're being addressed through other fora. But they're not the focus of today's event, which is to review the ecological and fisheries management aspects of safeguarding the long-term sustainability of the fishery. And some of the reasons for our concern about this are their sedentary life cycle, which makes them vulnerable to overexploitation. It's an expanding fishery. It's expanded in recent years as growth in foreign markets has led to increased prices, which has led to an increase in the number of vessels actively targeting whelks. And whilst targeting by the under 10 metres was significant up until 2015, increasingly since that time, there's been more landings from the over 10 metre fleet. But despite that increased fishing effort, landings have remained relatively stable, which has led to concerns about long-term sustainability. It's a non-quota species, so it has limited data on stock status, and there are variable regional and national management measures. In terms of the regional inshore management between 0 to 6, a number of the IFCAs have a variety of measures, including flexible permit bylaws, specific minimum size limits that reflect regional variation in size of maturity. There are various effort restrictions, such as pot limits, and also riddle specifications. And we'll be hearing a little bit more about that later this afternoon. But outside 6 nautical miles, there's very little effort management in most UK waters, except in Wales, where the Welsh Government introduced a whelk fishing permit order in 2021, which set an annual catch limit and requires all vessels to have a permit. And so really in looking at the combination of all these factors, we believe that they make the fishery at risk of overexploitation without some intervention very shortly. So the purpose of this symposium today is first and foremost to share current information. We want to share the information that's out there and that's being carried out on research, the fishery status and trends, some of the current management measures that are in place, plans afoot for the whelk fisheries management plan, and the work that some of the groups that are established are doing, such as the Whelk Working Group and the Whelk Management Group. And all of this will hopefully lead to a really inclusive development of that whelk fisheries management plan and also inform future engagement plans for that. So we'll be taking a poll later on in the afternoon about what your preferences are for future engagement. So we've got a really full agenda. Very grateful to all the speakers who have made time. We wanted to do this to get as much information as possible out there. There has been a slight adjustment to the last session, and we're pleased to have an additional presentation to the agenda that was circulated yesterday from the Devon and Severn IFCA. So we'll get started with our first three speakers, covering some of the research being undertaken to inform management of whelk fisheries. Please do remember to post your questions in the Q&A box during the presentations, which will be answered at the end of the session. So first of all, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Chloe Smith, Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Officer with Southern IFCA and also Chair of the Whelk Working Group, who will open for us this afternoon with a presentation on that group's work and remit. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me at the first Whelk Symposium. As you said, I am an officer at the Southern Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority and the current chair of the Whelk Working Group, not the first. So what is the Whelk Working Group? Well, the Whelk Working Group was formed by Eastern Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority in February 2019. The group was created because management bodies recognised that the UK whelk fishery had grown considerably over the last decade and was largely unregulated, leaving the fishery at risk of being overexploited. At the time, there were no other whelk-focused groups in the UK or specifically within ICES. The group is made of many members, including inshore fisheries and conservation authorities and other fisheries management bodies, government conservation and research institutions, and stakeholder and academic research institutions. So what are the goals of the Whelk Working Group? Here you can see the Whelk Working Group goals. The group was mainly set up to facilitate communication and collaboration between its members and to improve and align research practices between these organisations. The group also aims to improve the quality and extent of whelk fisheries information, research data and other information available to its members. So what has the group achieved over the past 3 years? The group meet approximately 3 times a year via Teams and originally face-to-face, although that sadly hasn't happened since then, and has set up a Google Drive which is accessible to all its members. The Google Drive contains a wealth of information on whelk management and research. The group has also created a number of summary documents and collated other whelk-related information such as habitat assessments, data on parasites, standard operating procedures, and more. The group worked with the Good Fish Guide to improve the information available under this resource and to better inform the ratings of the whelk fisheries within this guide. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the group has provided an easy platform for management bodies and research groups to share information, lessons learned, and best practice, something we at Southern IFCA have definitely benefited from. So at each meeting, members update one another on the progress of the research and other activities they are conducting regarding whelks. And in 2014, DEFRA published the now well-known piece of research on the size of maturity in whelk across the UK. It found that in almost all areas, the whelk minimum conservation reference size of 45 millimetres was too small to enable whelk to mature before being harvested. And as you can see, this sparked a lot of research looking at size of maturity at more local scales across the UK and abroad, many of which found that some really does vary across relatively small geographical scales, for example, within an individual IFCA district. More detailed research has also studied whelk age, growth, and influencing factors, and has found that whelk size at age, as well as growth, also varies across small geographical scales and can be dependent upon sea bottom temperature. Furthermore, a number of organisations are now also conducting or developing whelk stock assessments to inform fisheries management and publishing literature on these. So what's the future of the Whelk Working Group? Well, I hope the group continues to meet as long as it's beneficial to its members. There are now a small number of other groups, who I believe we'll be hearing from later today, which also focus on whelks, and the Whelk Working Group is connected to these to ensure the work is not repeated. The group will continue to provide that opportunity for collaboration and sharing of information, as well as learning from one another. And it will continue to update its summaries and information available on the Google Drive resource so that members can continue to utilise that resource. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Chloe. That's brilliant. And I think that working group has been really effective at pooling resources and information and generating some really effective sort of research plans. So really look forward to continuing to hear more about how that develops. Thank you, Chloe. So next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Natalie Hold from Bangor University, who's going to present on some very relevant research being undertaken to inform sustainable management of whelk fisheries in Wales.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Natalie Hold. I head up the fisheries team at Bangor University, and recently we've been working quite closely with Welsh Government to provide evidence and research to underpin their recent changes to policy. We've got a blank slide there. There we go. So I guess the first thing to think about is the fact that we do have what ICES would consider a category 4 or 5 stock, so that we had very little data to start with when we started this journey. So obviously, if you're at category 4 or 5, you have very limited data, and also the length of any time series of data is quite limited. So we had to start from scratch, basically. So that's kind of the start of the journey, and that's where I started working with Welsh Government on these things. So I think it's important to state that where we're at now is sort of stage 1. It was never considered that we would be able to get to sort of the perfect stock assessment and the perfect data gathering system in one go. So our initial aims were to ensure biological sustainability of the stock, the sustainability of the livelihoods reliant on the whelk fishing within the Welsh zone, and also to ensure that what we put in place at this stage is adaptive, so that it's not stagnated and can be progressed and improved as the relevant data arrives. So one of the first things, and Chloe touched on this, one of the first things that we wanted to understand was this variation in biological parameters. So if we're looking in the long term for any types of stock assessments, obviously a lot of the input data is regarding biological parameters. So understanding some of those, that variation was a really useful starting point. So I just wanted to sort of show some variation that we're getting within Welsh waters. So this is size at age, and you can see that whilst most of them are reasonably similar, although the growth does vary differently and the L infinities are slightly differently, we do get these odd pockets of whelk that really just don't grow very much at all. And it's very similar in size at maturity. So that the axis here, this is the y-axis is proportion mature, and this is the same color coding. So you can see that those that don't grow very large sizes actually also obviously mature at a smaller size. So what we're looking at here is that the majority of the stocks that we've looked at, the current MLS in Welsh waters, looks reasonably appropriate. Although it's obviously very difficult having an MLS in such a variable stock, and I think that brings up really interesting management issues. For example, this yellow stock is now not commercially viable at the current MLS because of that variability in size at maturity. So I think understanding that variability is going to be really key. So I was brought in after the consultation. So there was a plan from Welsh Government to have an annual catch limit, so that's the ACL. And my role and my colleague's role was to try and understand how best to make that work and what evidence there was to underpin that. So we started looking at IC's advice for data poor fisheries. And obviously, if you have a data poor stock and you have uncertainty in the data, then a precautionary approach is considered. And this can often include up to a 20% buffer applied to any catch limits where there's uncertainty in the data. So we started to look at how, without a full-on stock assessment that might need 20 years worth of landings and catch data, what could we do to improve our certainty in our data that we've got? So, so size-based indicators with reference points can be calculated to infer the health of the stock and provide greater certainty. So this is on the understanding that a heavily exploited stock will have a different size and age structure than a sustainably fished or an unfished stock. So that was our first starting point. So there's a working group in ICES have developed some reference points to monitor against, and these assess if the size structure of the population is considered healthy. And some of these size-based indicators have reference points that are considered to be, from theoretical perspectives, as proxies to fishing around maximum sustainable yield. Some of these indicators are specific to assessing the conservation of the smaller juvenile whelks, so ensuring that there's recruitment into the population and fishery, whilst other of these indicators assess the conservation of larger, older individuals, ensuring there is a healthy adult spawning stock to maintain the reproductive output. So the advice is not to choose a single indicator, but to choose a suite of indicators so that you can get a cross-section. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So I can share these later. I don't expect people to sort of read this as we go through, but I just wanted to give a kind of flavour of some of the indicators that we've been looking at. And I'm happy for this to go through so people can have a better look. But for example, these first three look very much at the conservation of smaller individuals. So they're looking at different ways of understanding if the size and age structure of the stock is showing a healthy recruitment of younger individuals. And then these two here, LMAX 5%, which is the mean size of the largest 5% of the catch, and the proportion of mega spawners, they look at the kind of the large spawning biomass within the stock. And we have calculated this column here is the calculation of the reference point itself from our data that we get from the surveys. And then we have limit and target reference points. So the limit reference points are at a point where theoretical approaches would predict that you might be at risk of overfishing and potentially collapse. And target reference points are what we're aiming for. So this is going to be around about maximum sustainable yield. So like I said, please don't worry about reading through that. I will make sure that gets shared. So we decided to each of these indicators at each of the sites, the stock will be described in a poor status if indicators are below the limit reference points, satisfactory if they are between the two reference points, and then if they're within 10% of the target reference point, i.e. the proxy of maximum sustainable yield, they're considered in good biological status. So like I said before, three of the indicators assess the conservation of smaller individuals in the stock, two of them the larger individuals, and the L mean is obviously the central size distribution of the stock. So we've got quite a broad suite of indicators there. So that's kind of how we are assessing the biological sustainability of the stocks in Wales. And obviously we're still at the start of this journey. We have the first year's worth of data. And what I should point out is that in most species, and in particular species where you can get a lot of interannual variation in biological indicators, which is the case with whelk, their growth rates do seem to be affected by temperature, then you want to use averages over several years so that you're not making decisions based on an unusual year. And we usually say that approximately a generation times worth of time series. And so for Whelk, that's going to be about 4 or 5 years. So we're at the start of this journey at the moment. So the second aim was to sort of ensure that any management measures that came in didn't disadvantage any particular sector of the fleet or put anybody's livelihood at risk. So what was done to begin with was that the average landings and the number of vessels fishing Whelk into Wales was looked at on a month-by-month basis between 2015 and 2019. And actually this pattern of monthly fishing, whilst there is some variation, interannual variation as shown by the error bars, was fairly stable. And so we decided that if we could maintain the ability for people to have this annual pattern of fishing, so that no quota was used up all at the start of the season, for example, so that boats that were reliant on fishing throughout the year weren't put out of business. So that was kind of the start of us looking at that economic and social sustainability. So what this gives us, as well as having an annual catch limit, we get this monthly catch profile. So what we do is we apportion that annual catch limit across the months, and then we can track to see how that annual catch limit is being used up over the year, with the ability to decrease the monthly landings quota if it looks like we're overshooting the annual catch limit. So as far as I'm aware, on last speaking, there's been no issues with overshooting these annual predictions, monthly predictions for this first year of the annual catch limit. So the hope is that everybody can continue to fish in roughly the same pattern with regards to their need to fish for Whelk at certain times of the year. So for the future, now I'm going to start this by saying that this photo has caused a little bit of a stir on social media. I would like to state that these rubber bands were specifically sourced to be plastic free. The filler is a natural clay. They biodegrade. The retention on the Whelk has been 100%, so they're not going to ping off and animals aren't going to get caught in them. I am aware that there's probably always unintended consequences, and I'm more than happy for people to speak to me about that, but it wasn't. I hope that we've done as much due diligence with this project as we can. So the idea is that we want to estimate abundance and density at 6 to 8 sites across Wales. And we want to do this so that we can start to move away from this reference period for an annual catch limit, because it's just that, it's a reference period. We don't know whether it's too high or too low. It's just a way of putting the brakes on for the time being until we get more data. Then within the same sites, we are looking at catch and landings per pot. We also have some baited underwater video cameras set at each site, and we're looking at how those different methods are potentially able to capture variation in abundance and density. So the idea is that for any stock assessment, we need to start to understand and have at least a relative abundance index that varies as the abundance on the ground changes. So it's a way to us to understand if BRUVs or pot-based surveys can actually provide a useful abundance index going forwards for us to move away from this reference period. There's quite a few other things going on with the group, but I thought that was a reasonable summary to start. So I will stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalie. That was absolutely fascinating and lots to take in there. And so, yes, be very useful to share your slides after the event if people want to take a little longer to look through those. Excuse me. We're finally going to invite Morgan Amelot, who's a fishery research engineer at IFCA. And Morgan is going to share some results from a stock assessment model that they've applied to French fisheries in the Eastern English Channel. Over to you, Morgan.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm gonna try to explain to you what we've done with the French fisheries with all the limitation due to the lack of data that Natalie presented right before. So as you know, so I will start with a short introduction, then present you the data I used for that and the models, and focused on the result from the case study on the Eastern English Channel Whelk fisheries in France, and then present some of the discussion points and perspectives that pop up from this project. So worldwide, about 80% of fish stocks are not analytically assessed or not assessed at all, principally due to data limitation. And as Natalie said, there is a lot of possibilities to try to work on this assessment right now that are proposed by the ICES. Furthermore, 30% of the assessed stocks are overfished, so we can assume that more this proportion is likely to be higher within the non-assessed stock. During the last decade, there is an important amount of models that were especially dedicated to these stocks. There are three types of models for that, mainly catch per unit of effort, just looking at the trend of abundance indices or catch per unit of effort. Then you have surplus production models, and finally land-based models. All of them require different data. For mollusk and crustacean fisheries, there is an increasing need of stock assessment because the species are hard to assess using analytical stock assessment, mainly due to the absence of important dedicated surveys. As you know, there is mainly surveys in Europe on groundfish fishery or on pelagic fish, but not that many on mollusk or crustaceans. And it is hard to get a representative catch per unit of effort, dependent of the type of gear we're using and the estimation of the attractability area that isn't easy to do. And most of the data are missing when you are looking at logbooks or national database. And finally, there is the difficulties that are linked to the biological specificities of those species. They are hard to age, hard to mark, and there is not that many projects at the Capture Mark Recapture project Natalie presented. So all these factors combined with the potential increase of fishing pressure on these species, resulting in the increasing need for stock assessment. In France, from the Eastern English Channel, we have the area is going from Cherbourg to the border of Belgium. But we have three stocks units that are defined, that are dependent from the biological specificities of the stocks, as well as the fishery specificities. So in yellow, you have the fishery from Calvados, which is the oldest in the Eastern English Channel and dates from the 20th century. In the middle, in gray, you have the fishery from Seine-Maritime, which only exists since 2009-2010. And the last one in the Hauts-de-France is very, very recent and only exists since 2015-2016. In terms of models, we tried to apply some surplus production models only, since we didn't have representative lens data to work with lens-based model. And we use three different kinds of production models that are all based on two formulations of surplus production. So surplus production is basically saying that the biomass at the next time step is dependent from the biomass from the previous time step, times having crazy in intrinsic growth rate, which is dependent from the mortality and the reproduction of the species, and dependent of the carrying capacity of the environment, and finally of a fishing mortality. Here you have the fishing mortality formulating in two ways. So either you directly have the catch, CT, on the Formula 1, or you have the fishing mortality times the biomass, FT, times BT. So the three models we explored were CMSY, which could be used as catch-only method, so only with catch data, or you can use it with catch and abundance indices. Then you have the surplus production model in continuous time, picked, which is one of the models that will be tested for all category 3 stocks in the ISS in the next years. And finally, the JABA, which is a surplus production model as well, but with a Bayesian formulation. So you can use informative pre-years on the life history parameters. In terms of data, what we needed to run these stocks were stock definition, information on the ecological features of the species and the fishery, so to be able to define the spatial boundaries of each stock. Then we needed catch data, which was actually a kind of an issue since we do have catch data on the species in France, but we are missing some information on the effort relative to this catch data on an important time series. And when we're using surplus production model, we need at least 10 years of data. And then finally, the abundance indices, which is definitely the hardest path to get, since we're not sure that the abundance indices based on catch per unit of effort are really representative of the abundance. Finally, life history parameters on the intrinsic growth rate, carrying capacity, and sometimes the initial biomass at the beginning of the time series could be used to try to help the model converge based on the knowledge we have on the ecological feature of the species. In our case, so in the Eastern English Channel whelk fishery, we have three very, very different dynamics in terms of catch. So in Calvados, what you can see is that we had very high catch at the beginning of the 2000s, and they were probably even higher, a bit higher before. Then we have an important decrease from 2007 to 2014. And then you finally have an increase at the end, but at a lower level from 2015 to 2020. In the two other areas, the catches are only increasing with low data in 2020, but the low catch in 2020 are mainly due to the COVID crisis. So it's probably not representative of the catch for that. In terms of effort, the dynamics are pretty much the same than for the catch, except for the Calvados, when you can see that the effort didn't rise at the same level than before. It's still way lower than it was previous to 2007 on the end of the time series. Finally, on the catch per unit of effort, we calculated, so it was a generalized linear model that was used to try to cover the lack of data we had on some effort to try to define this catch per unit of effort. For that, we have three very different dynamics. And as you can see in the Hauts-de-France, so the dark blue line, there is a lot of variability in the catch per unit of effort, which is probably due to misreporting before the fishery really starts, or before 2015. So we will, for the model, we did use the catch per unit of effort for the Calvados and Seine-Maritime for the entire time period, while for the Hauts-de-France, we only used the 5 last years of information. In terms of results, what you can see on the right is the relative biomass in comparison to the biomass at MSY. So the dotted line is for biomass divided by the biomass at MSY of 1. Basically, in stock assessment, you consider that if this this relative biomass is lower than 1, your stock have been overfished. And then on the bottom graph, you have the relative fishing mortality in comparison to the fishing mortality at MSY. And you consider that the stock is overfished if this fishing mortality is over 1. What you can see here, I presented the median of each model, each stock's estimation. So I did run in combination of 12 models, so SIMS-Y, JABA, and SPICT, depending of different life history parameters. In the outputs, the only stock units we had with a big relative biomass under 1 was the one from the Calvados, which is probably linked to the long-term exploitation of this stock. For the 2 other one, the relative biomass is over 1. If you're looking at the fishing mortality, then the highest fishing mortality is in the Hauts-de-France. So the dun that was exploited only for 5 years, with a very high fishing mortality estimated. For the two other ones, the fishing mortality is under 1. However, when I looked at the biomass trends during the last 5 years, all the stocks units had a biomass trends, a decreasing biomass trends, which means that despite the fact that the fishing mortality is under 1 for the Calvados and the Seine Maritime, the stocks are still decreasing in terms of biomass. So for what about these outputs? First, we really have in France to improve the data collection. Since these models are mainly driven, apart from the catch MSY, by the abundance indices, we have to consider that if there is some error on the catch per unit of effort, and if this catch per unit of effort is not representative from the real abundance, then we probably don't get the real signal of the stock. We also need to improve the information on the life history parameters and the stock boundaries. And for that to be able to know what are the boundaries of the Whelk stocks in the Eastern Channel, not just in the French part of it. Then we also have to work on how to improve this model use. Since these surplus production models were first designed for fish, and mainly trawl fishery, to be honest, there is some issues on the hypothesis linked to this model. So if we want to be sure that this model are properly fitting the characteristic from the trout fishery and the Whelk fishery especially, we probably have also to try to get a simulation framework that really fit the trout fishery specificities to be able to test each model performances against this fishery. Then we also have the possibility to test other models, such as land-based model, and to try to work on another data source. And also, I presented you the median of all results, but there is different possibility to combine the outputs of different models. So you can work on the median or the mean of all the models you run, but you can also try to weight the outputs of your model depending on the performances of the model. So if through the simulation framework, you're able to know that one model is better than the other, then it's probably better to weight it correctly to be able to get the good outputs. So here you have all the references from the different models, and yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Morgane. That's, again, very fascinating piece of research there. Just shows how complex some of these models are and how much data is needed. But I think all three presentations from Morgane, Natalie, and Chloe as well really show that there's a lot of effort now going into filling some of these data gaps. And so I'm now going to hand over to Jacob to share the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thanks all for those presentations. They were fantastic. We've got a few questions coming in already, but please do keep them coming, and we can make sure they end up with the relevant people. So first off, I can see there's a question from Robert Wakeford from MRAG. Robert, if you're there, do feel free to come and say your question directly. I believe it's probably for Natalie, this one.
Hi, thanks for that. Yeah, very interesting presentations, and thanks for the time in doing that. I had a question about the biological reference points. Obviously, these are obviously quite challenging to construct, and I was interested to know whether you took into account the ecological status within the ecosystem. So some of these are typically low trophic level species. How did, if at all, did you take that into account in sort of coming up with what those look like? And do they differ from finfish biological reference points? And if they do, you know, what is that?
Okay, so I guess, yeah, I think what you're asking is are they appropriate for Whelk as opposed to other species? And you're right that a lot of this work at the ICES level has started with finfish. And I guess that's where we started, and that was our exact question, was sort of, are these appropriate for Whelk? And I think there's still room to improve on that. But there was quite a lot of work done on on looking at particularly some of the L5 max, for example, had looked at taking some species with different life histories, so looking at a herring or a mackerel versus some elasmobranchs, rays and sharks, and also lobsters, and looking at how robust or sensitive these were to these different life history characteristics. And for example, the L5 max, it didn't perform as well for those types of animals like live bearing sharks and rays, where they put a lot of maternal effort into one offspring. However, looking at some of the biological parameters for whelk that we had, it did seem to fall within the simulated parameters where it could be robust for that. So we're quite lucky in Wales. We've actually had quite a lot of time to gather actual empirical data on the life history traits. So a lot of what we put into these were empirical estimates of L infinity and the growth rate K, L50. I think the only information we did have to take from literature at this point was natural mortality M, and there were a couple of estimates, and they all came in at roughly a similar ballpark, as in natural mortality is quite high for whelk. So I think that in the answer, I think there's more work to do, but I think we have moved away from just taking reference points that were developed for finfish, and we have actually taken those underlying theoretical models and put the biological parameters for whelk into them. So hopefully they're an improvement on where we started about a year ago, and there's probably still room for improvement as we go forwards.
Thanks very much, Natalie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, so next we come on to a question from an anonymous attendee this is directed for Chloe, I think, who asks about whether fishermen were invited to join the Whelk working group and the potential role of fishermen within that group. So over to you on that, Chloe.
Thanks, Jacob. I wasn't present during the initial creation of the Whelk working group, but my understanding is that the answer is no. And the reason being is that the Whelk working group was not set up to form any management for the fisheries or to have a particularly strong effect on that as such. I tried to describe that it was very much a knowledge sharing facility for those groups of organisations that are conducting research or stock assessments, etc. So that's the main reason that there aren't currently any fishers on the group, and I would imagine it's probably unlikely that there will be. There are now other groups, which I won't go into detail because I know they might be presenting later, where they are based on a majority sort of stakeholder membership. So thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. All right, moving on, I can see we've got a question from Tim Ferrero for Morgan. So Tim, do please feel free to dive in on that one.
Hi, Morgan. Hopefully I'm unmuted. Very interesting, thank you. I was just wondering, in those years when the catch per unit effort was low, was overall fishing effort also reduced in response to that, or did the overall effort continue at sort of similar levels? I'm trying to get a bit of an idea about why populations bounce back.
Hi. Yeah, the effort reduced quite considerably during this period. So the fisheries, the whelk fisheries in the Calvados and the western part of the Eastern English Channel in France, it's mainly fishermen that are targeting at the same time crustacean and whelks. So they have the license for the two of them. They're using different traps, but they're switching from one to another depending on the resource. So when the whelk catch per unit of effort reduced, most of them switched to other fisheries during this period. And then the effort never increased back, only in the very recent years, but for like around 10 years, the effort was quite low.
Great, thanks for that.
Thank you both. We've got a question in from Sarah Clark, one of our panelists. Sarah, do feel free to ask it.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Natalie, actually, and I think there was a question that came back from Sam, which is quite similar. You mentioned about a whelk population. It was yellow on one of your earlier charts. That the population was smaller at size of sexual maturity. And I just wondered if you'd gone back to monitor that population, seeing that you said that no one fished there any longer because it was below the minimum size, whether that population is actually maturing at a larger size now, which might be indicative of a recruitment overfishing.
Yeah, so yeah, really interesting. So the first study was done, well, it was published in 2015, so I expect the data was collected in about 2014. And then we have literally just redone it. We've just finished all the lab work. And the size at maturity is almost exactly the same. So that's quite a large time span. And the L infinity is almost exactly the same. So that was really interesting. And we don't fully understand that population yet. And we haven't yet come across any other populations quite as extreme as that. However, what I will say at the moment is that we have been doing a lot of participatory research. So obviously everybody knows that it can be quite difficult to get funding to go and do big independent surveys. So actually we've been working really closely with fishermen, which has been great because they've been engaged with the research, but it probably does mean that we're slightly biased in the sites that we go to, because a fisherman will know where, you know, he's not going to deliberately go and fish at a site where they're all undersized. It wouldn't make sense for him. So I think there's some more work to do to explore that, and it's certainly on our wish list and on our funding radar to try and find some project money to look at the environmental drivers of that. We do think that temperature is probably playing a role. So whelks are a boreal species, so they tend to prefer colder water. But what's really interesting about them is when they're juveniles, they tend to respond positively to warmer temperatures. So their growth actually gets quite fast as juveniles in warmer temperatures, but they actually stop growing a lot earlier. So what you find is that in warmer temperatures, by the time they reach the age of 4 or 5, their growth will be very plateaued. Whereas in some of those other ones, they were actually continuing to grow 7, 8 years old. So I think there's quite a lot of work to do still to fully understand it. But so far, so how many years is that? It's about 6 years in between the two studies. There's not much change in the size of maturity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Sam, I think that probably answers your question too. Which brings us to the end of the Q&A. I don't see any further questions coming in at the moment. So we'll press on with session 2, I think. So back over to you, Sam.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Just some really, really interesting discussion there. And we're now going to move on to the next session, which is on fishery trends and status. We've got 3 presentations, and we're going to start with Andrea O'Shaughnessy, who's Principal Fisheries Manager at the Marine Management Organisation, who will be presenting an overview of UK whelk landings data. Over to you, Andrea.
Hello everyone. I don't know if you can see me. My camera doesn't seem to be. That's better. Okay, sorry about that. So hello, I'm Andrea O'Shaughnessy. I'm a Principal Fisheries Manager for Vessel Licensing at the Marine Management Organisation. Thank you very much for allowing me to attend today. I'm going to present data on whelk landings in the UK. I think most of you are probably familiar with the MMO, but just in case, the MMO is a DEFRA-sponsored government body. We have around 400 people. We are a manager for independent regulator for England's seas. We have a very wide remit, including fishery management, marine conservation, grants to the fishing industry. We cover from the shore to the median line, or the 200-mile limit. We work closely with the devolved administrations, the Crown dependencies, the IFCAs, and one of the key roles of the MMO is to collect fisheries data, and this comes into us via a number of ways. We get a lot of this data from the fishing vessels themselves and from the buyers of fish when it's first sold. The data being presented today is from sales notes, and this is all data of UK landings. That is from UK and foreign vessels that land into UK ports only. Doesn't include foreign landings. I'm going to show a number of graphs with MMO landings and sales data on it for you. So first of all, I think it's already been said today that Whelk is a non-quota stock currently. The MMO holds landing data going back to around 2008. The graph presented shows the yearly average value of whelks landed by administration and fleet segment from 2008 to 2021. So you'll see that England lands the most in terms of monetary value, followed by Wales, Scotland, and then Northern Ireland. In terms of the fleet segment, the over 10 non-sector lands the most across all administrations. That's followed by the sectors, those vessels in the POs, and then lastly is the under 10 non-sector vessels. So focusing on English fleet segments across the most recent years, the under 10 metre non-sector consistently landed the most whelks, followed by the over 10 non-sector, and then last by the producer organisation sector. And the trend seems to have remained stable over the last 5 years. Looking at where whelks are caught, the table shows the 5 highest landings of whelks in tonnes by ICES areas. The weight of whelks is averaged on year from 2008 to 2021. As you can see from the data, most whelks are caught around the English Channel with 4C, 7D and 7E, and up to the Irish Sea with 7F and 7A. The top 10 ports into which whelks are landed are displayed in the table, with the average weight of the whelks landed in the port per year from 2008 to 2021 again. The whelks are landed at Shoreham, Eastbourne, Weymouth, Whitehaven, Portsmouth, Wells next to sea in Norfolk, Fleetwood and Lowestoft. The graph here shows the average weight of whelks caught across the year from 2008 to 2021. And also it shows that the whelk season is predominantly from March to July, but we have peaks in April and May. So as we've said, there's no quota for over 10 metre fishing vessels. Their licence doesn't include any of that. This came about a few years ago due to vessel transfers from outside England with no fixed quota allocations. You do have to put a fishing plan in place when you want to transfer over to England from another fisheries administration, and you're required to bring in what you want to take out. That's not applicable to under 10 metre fishing vessels, but there's no specific mention in the licence and no quota at all. Currently, there are local IFCA rules in place, as we've heard, but not England-wide rules. These IFCA bylaws include different types of management measures, such as minimum sizes and permits. And as we've heard, Wales have the permit in place. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. And that gives us a really good overview of the whole UK whelk fishery. And I think Andrea's not able necessarily to stay on for the Q&A session, but has been posted in the chat. She will be able to answer direct questions that can be forwarded to her via email. So do please post your questions in the Q&A and we'll make sure that they reach Andrea and the MMO to respond to them and get a reply back. So now going to introduce our next speaker, which is Sarah Birchenough, who's Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Officer at Southern IFCA, and she's kindly providing an overview of some key whelk fisheries trends in English waters based on a report recently published by the Association of IFCAs and New Economics Foundation Consulting. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, as Sam said, I'm going to present some of the data which was collected as part of a report between the Association of IFCAs which oversees all 10 IFCAs around the country, and the New Economics Foundation. The report can be found online. I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm reporting this data. However, I wasn't actually involved in the production of this report, so my ability to answer questions on this is going to be very limited. However, we are able to take questions away to the authors of the report if there are any questions that can't be answered today. So the report itself was looking at regional inshore fisheries management plans in light of the changes which are coming as a result of the Fisheries Act 2020. And it looked at 7 wild capture shellfish fisheries in the context of this concept of fisheries management plans, looking at sort of social, economic and ecological contribution of principal bivalve and crustacean inshore fisheries. And one of these was for whelk. So I'm going to go through a few of the figures that were included in this report in terms of landings data and value data and the general trends in activity in England. So what the report looked at was whelk landings into English ports. So looking at the cumulative landings for the period 2009 to 2019. So this is based on MMO data, which is the same data that Andrea was just talking about. However, this report will not include the most recent data, where there's probably likely to be some variation due to COVID and EU exits and all the multitude of things that the industry has been dealing with over the last couple of years. But you can see from this image that there's a strong representation on the south coast of England in terms of whelk landings. The list of ports that Andrea just showed us is pretty much reflected in this diagram. There's also some key landing sites on the North Devon coast, and then in the northeast and northwest and on the east of the country there as well. So there's a good spread in whelk fishing throughout England, with this sort of quite tight concentration then on the south coast. This is the same sort of information, but looking at it by IC subrectangle. Again, it shows that focus on the south coast in the inshore sector. In 2018, there were 303 under 10 metre vessels and 113 over 10 metre vessels, which were recorded as landing whelks into UK ports. And in 2019, the under 10 metres had increased to 319, and the over 10 metres very slightly to 114 different vessels. So the report looks at the whelk landings into England over that period of 2009 to 2019. There is something missing off the legend here. The pink bars represent the over 10 metre fleet. And this looks at the sum of that landed by all vessels within either the under 10 metre or the over 10 metre fleet. So for the under 10 metre fleet, the landing in tonnes has varied from approximately 3,500 in 2018 to around 7,000 in the period between 2013 and 2015. As you can see, there's been some variation. There was a sort of a general increase up to about 2015, then a dip, and then there seemed to be a slight recovery in those landing levels in 2019. For the over 10 metre vessels, as demonstrated by the dotted line on the diagram, there does seem to have been a general increase in landings, although there is some slight variation within that, from approximately 3,000 tonnes in 2009 to about 7,000 tonnes in 2019. Looking at this in terms of the value for the same time period, for the under 10 metre vessels, the sum of what's been landed varies from about 2.5 million in 2009 up to about 9 million in 2019. And as would be expected, it follows a similar trend to the landings data, with a general increase up to sort of 2015-16, then a slight decline, and then a higher landing value corresponding to that increase in landing weight in 2019. For the over 10 metre vessels, the value varied from just under 2 million in 2019 to just over 9 million in 2009, to just over 9 million in 2019. And apart from a slight dip in 2017, this has been a general increase in value over the time period. The report also looked at the first sale average prices for the same time period. So this is the price paid per kilo for whelks, both again for the under 10 metre and the over 10 metre fleet. From the under 10 metre fleet, there's been seen to be an approximate 40% rise in the first sale value, from about £1 per kilo to over £1.40 per kilo by 2019. And this is believed to be as a result of high demand and prices paid by exporters such as South Korea. As I said, because this data only goes up to 2019, we're not in these graphs going to see any effect of any of the changes from COVID or EU exit. For the over 10 metre vessels, there is a similar pattern of increasing value. It started slightly lower at about 80p per kilo and has risen to just under £1.40 per kilo by 2019. So those are all of the graphs that are presented in that report, just to give a brief overview of what's happening in England. As I said, the link to the report is on the second slide. I don't know if that can be made available, but if anyone's interested in looking into it further, the link is provided there. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. And as you say, that report is available. We'll make sure it's popped in the chat in a moment. And I'd recommend anyone looking at that. It provides a really good overview of not only whelk, but also crab, lobster, cuttlefish, scallops and cockles. So it's an excellent report just for giving that overview of some of our non-quota inshore fisheries. So now going to hand over to Hannah Fennell from Heriot-Watt University. She's going to be presenting on the interim results from a recent study that they've carried out that involves getting information from fishermen. Over to you.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear and see me okay. It's really good to be here today and also just see so much interest in whelks. So yes, I'm Hannah Fennell, I'm from Heriot-Watt University and I'm one of the leads on this project. My colleague Thomas Fortier, who was meant to be here today, but unfortunately he's ill, so you're just going to be stuck with me. So I'm going to be talking about a piece of work that we've been doing for the Whelk Management Group, which is being run by Shellfish and includes a whole host of collaborators that I think will be touched on in a later presentation today. This piece of work, it began in the spring of 2020 in the height of the lockdown. And the Whelk Management Group was interested in understanding the physical variation in whelk populations around the UK coastline and using fisher ecological knowledge to do this. As we've already mentioned in this symposium, the life history of whelks means they're really vulnerable to overexploitation, and they're quite slow growing, so they don't have a planktonic larval stage, so they've got highly localized and genetically closed populations, which has implications for management. In the UK, the only regulation of the whelk fishery is the EU minimum landing size, really, of 45 mil. I mean, there are some exceptions for this in Shetland and the Isle of Man, and some of the IFCAs as well have their own rules. But we found in studies that the 45 mil minimum landing size is insufficient, as the size of maturity for the most common whelk populations exceeds this. So we need a better understanding of our local whelk populations. So to get a better understanding, we collected anecdotal information from commercial whelk fishers around the UK. We asked fishers to identify areas where distinct whelk populations could be identified based on their physical characteristics, and we mapped these responses against environmental data. So ultimately, we're hoping that these results can be used to inform management, so highlighting areas where whelk populations might require separate attention from scientists, and also helping to identify the potential impacts of climate change on these whelk populations and the fishes and the communities that are relying on them. So this project began, as I said, in 2020. So we used an online survey to collect the data. And the survey ran from June to September, and it asked contextual questions about fishery activity. So for example, vessel size, effort, number of pots, the species that people fished apart from whelks. And we also asked fishers to identify on maps local variations in whelk populations based on their observations. So things like the size of the shell colour, the meat colour and yield, the shell shape, and the presence of fouling organisms on the shell. So we found a number of interesting results. Sorry, I've got so many screens on at the moment. The majority of the responses that we got were from the south end of England and Wales. So over 70% of the respondents were full-time fishers operating as a day boat and returning to the same port each day. And 77% of the respondents said they had the ability to differentiate where whelks came from based on their physical appearance. Over 55% of our respondents fish almost exclusively whelks, which we defined as being 70 to 100% of their total annual catch value, caught being whelks. And the other species people would target would be lobsters and brown crab. Most of the respondents that we spoke to or that we did the survey had a boat that was under 10 meters or under in length, and there was an average pot soak time of 24 hours. 90% of the respondents hauled between 1 and 1,000 pots a day, with an equal split between the subcategories of 0 to 500 pots and 501 pots to 1,000 pots. And we found that the soak time didn't correlate with the number of pots per string. When it came to deciding where to fish, we asked fishers what they considered to be the most important factors when selecting a fishing ground. So respondents preferred a high likelihood of large catches over environmental variables, so things like the strength of the tide, the exposure of the site, when they were selecting an area to fish. They also reported sandy and gravel seabeds as being the most productive area for whelks, which is something that's been backed up in the literature. And respondents also reported that observing larger whelks during the colder months of the year, as well as finding eggs in this period. And this is something we want to explore further because data from other areas suggests that whelk eggs are mainly found in the summer months. So that's something we're really interested in looking at going forwards. So now the results for the mapping responses and the environmental variables. You're going to have to bear with me here because Thomas is the brains behind the analysis here, and I'm going to have to just try and do his work some justice. So we identified a range of environmental variables to look at using literature review. There were 3 physical characteristics that we were interested in. So that was bathymetry, seabed substrate, and the horizontal currents. And we also looked at 3 chemical characteristics, so salinity, temperature, and ocean acidity. And there was a number of ways to source the variables, and we were selecting the sources for the variables using 4 parameters, which were evaluated on 2 levels. So there was the legitimacy of the data source and the localizations available. So we wanted the data to come from a website that was supported by multiple governments, so international data sets. And we also wanted one that covered the UK exclusive economic zone. We also wanted to make sure that the data we was looking at included, had adequate depth and temporal range. So because, well, obviously on the seabed, we wanted to make sure the environmental variables within the data set included variables collected by the sea floor as well. So what we, or rather Thomas, did was we used a species distribution model alongside the environmental variables to understand the relationship between the two. So he used a MaxEnt model due to its ability to outperform other models for small data samples. It's got a fast computation time given the complexity of the information, and it's also used very commonly for environmental niche modeling and species distribution models as well. To assess the correlation between fishery observations and environmental variables, we used Pearson's correlation test, and also the Kruskal-Wallis and NOVA test for the non-normal data. However, these two tests only study the correlation between the pairs of variables, so to analyze the multi-collinearity, so I'm saying that wrong, linked to the combination of variables, used a variance inflation factor as well. So these are our results, and obviously you can't really see them properly right now, but you will be able to dive into them in more depth in a report published later this year. But a quick overview of them shows that we found that variables in currents, salinity, and bathymetry link to shell color variation. We found a correlation between pH and salinity and whelk size, and we found a correlation between temperature and currents and the presence of fouling organisms. We also found that temperature, pH, and the bathymetry have a relationship with the color and the yield of whelk meat. So some of this is stuff that we expected to find, but other things are quite interesting. So for example, pH and salinity and the size of the whelk. So what are our next steps? What are we doing next? So we've been successful along with Seafish, Bangor University, and of course Heriot-Watt University in applying for the UK government FISP fund to let us continue this work. This has got a lot of different strands to it, but one of these is going to be continuing on the work for this project. So we want to expand the survey area to try and generate responses from all around the UK, because at the moment our responses are quite localised to a few areas. And we want to try and hold in-person interviews with fishers, because now we don't have the restrictions of the lockdowns. We'll actually be able to get out there and speak to people and try and generate more data that way. So that's happening. It will hopefully be starting this summer, and it will be going on for the next year and a bit. In the very far future, one thing we'd really like to see is some field work to ground truth these results. So just going out and taking sample sizes of the whelks and also for environmental data as well. So it's really exciting. I'll make sure to put my email in the chat box if anyone wants to get in touch with me directly, but please do let me know if you've got any questions. And as I say, the report should be published on this later in the year. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. Really important piece of research, and delighted that that's got the funding to continue. So look forward to seeing that progress. So thank you very much indeed, Hannah, Sarah and Andrea, for your excellent insights into the whelk industry and fishery. And I'm now going to hand it back over to Jacob to chair the Q&A session on this.
Thank you very much, Sam. Do keep the questions coming, folks. Thank you very much for those presentations. Just to note that Andrew and Sarah won't be joining the Q&A, so it's just you, Hannah. Thank you for being here. But any questions about the topics that either Andrea or Sarah presented on, do just drop them in the same place, and we'll make sure they get to the relevant people. So first off, in terms of questions for you, Hannah, I can see there's one from Sam at the moment, who asks, go on, Sam, I'll let you ask in your own words.
No, I was just wondering, Hannah, you mentioned about the range of the survey was quite localised to, I think you said, the south and Wales, and I just wondered what the reason was for that.
Yeah, I think that was just because of the nature of the survey and how it was publicised. So we tried to get a range of responses from all over the coast. We put an advert in the Fishing News and we used social media to get it. But ultimately, I think fishers answer so many surveys that there is that survey fatigue. Because this project was put through the Whelk Management Group, there's quite a lot of representation from managers and fishers and people involved in the industry from Wales and the south of England in that group. So I think they were really able to use their network and encourage people to answer the survey. And as a result, we got a lot of responses from that area. I'm hoping that when people see the responses and people see the results from this round of the survey, they'll think, oh, that's actually very interesting, and they'll be more likely to do it next time. I also think having it in person might increase our chances of getting a wider coverage from around the UK as well.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Okay, we've got a question that's just come in from Freddie Watson. So Freddie, if you're there, please do fire away.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I was just wondering, firstly, what was the correlation between pH salinity and whelk size, and how do you predict the effects of climate change on their sizes in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's one I wish Thomas was here for. So I think we found that the whelks were generally smaller when it was a higher pH, and I think that's likely just to do with the composition of the shells. I think that climate change is going to have a huge impact on these populations. I think it's also going to affect the fishes and the communities that rely on them. One thing though I would really like to see is us to have more data going forward so we can say for sure really what's going on. But it's definitely something that we're putting into this recent FISP fund and we're going to be looking at over the coming year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I wonder if I could ask you a question as well, if that's all right. You mentioned that this started during 2020 at the height of the pandemic. I wondered if you felt that either your results could have differed if you did it in more normal times, and also how it potentially affected your methodology as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of the results and the responses we got, I don't think it affected it too much because we were asking not about current activities, but general activities. So, but it would still be interesting to compare the results that we got for this survey to ones that we'll get in the next round of surveys. I think in terms of, I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
In terms of the methodology, like did you adapt the way you ran it to account for?
Yeah, we did because of the lockdowns and things. We did it as an online survey, so I think that was also one of the reasons our response rates weren't as good as it would have been if we'd been able to go out in person. But obviously, that is a lot more time and resource intensive as well. So again, it'll be interesting to see how it differs when we do it this time, which will be in-person questions.
Great, thank you very much. That's really interesting. We've just had one question come in from Chloe Smith. So Chloe, please do go ahead and ask your question.
Hi Hannah, sorry, it was just off the back of the other question from Sam, I think it was. You mentioned the correlation between the pH. What was the correlation for salinity and whelk size?
That one, can I get back to you on that one? I want to double check first of all.
Of course, thank you.
Thanks, Faye. I think that's it in terms of questions at the moment. So we'll move ahead to the break. We're running a bit ahead of time. Sam, when would you like us to return for session 3?
Well, as you say, we're doing very well on time. Everyone will be able to go out and enjoy that amazing sunshine early tonight. So I think we'll stick to a 15-minute break. We're just over, but let's round it up to, I can't do my maths. Actually, if everyone's all right with a 12-minute break, then we'll keep on track and start again at 3:30. So hopefully enough time to get a cool drink or a cup of tea.
That sounds great. Thanks, Sam. See you soon.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you all managed a few minutes in the sun. It's absolutely glorious out there, at least in London where I am. I'm Morven Robertson and I'm Head of UK Projects for Blue Marine Foundation. And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing session 3, where we will be hearing about various management measures and tools being developed and implemented across the UK and some of the research underpinning them. So our first speaker I'm really pleased to introduce is Lewis Tattersall, Head of Fisheries Management at Seafish, who will provide an overview of the Whelk Management Group and Whelk Fisheries Management Plan being led by Seafish. Over to you, Lewis.
Hi there, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll assume we can. Thank you. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. It's really interesting so far, and it's great to see a sometimes underappreciated fishery receive so much attention. So yeah, just to set the scene, really, we've been invited to speak today on the Whelk Management Group and the work that the group is doing to develop fisheries management plans for whelk in English waters. To set the scene, I'll start by saying that Seafish actually facilitates a number of collaborative fisheries management groups, which I've listed here. And these groups are industry-led and were set up to give the seafood industry a forum through which to discuss and engage on issues impacting fisheries, to explore solutions, and to collaborate with regulators and scientific researchers. The portfolio of management groups that we facilitate at the moment includes the Shellfish Industry Advisory Group, which looks at issues that are of interest to all shellfish fisheries. So it looks at topics such as welfare and sentience issues. We have the Whelk Management Group, which is a subgroup of the overarching shellfish group, which I'll talk more about today. And then alongside that, we also have the Crab and Lobster Management Group, which focuses on issues relating to crab and lobster fisheries. We've also recently set up the Finfish Industry Advisory Group, which is focused on non-quota finfish stocks and looks to serve a similar function to the Shellfish Industry Advisory Group. So there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment around future fisheries management and developing management plans collaboratively with input from stakeholders from across the seafood supply chain. Seafish supports these groups by providing secretariat support and independent chairs. We pick up a lot of work arising from the groups. So for example, undertaking bespoke economic analyses, producing guidance and supporting the FMP development work. Finally, we also support the Shellfish Group's communications and work to encourage stakeholder participation. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So in terms of the Whelk Management Group, which is obviously the focus of today, that group was formed in early 2020 in response to industry stakeholder concerns about increasing fishing effort on the fishery and about the long-term sustainability of the stock. And at that point, Seafish was asked to help support the formation of a group and bring together people. And it was actually our first meeting was immediately before the pandemic, and I think was the last in-person meeting that quite a lot of us actually attended before going into various lockdowns. Since then, the group has met quarterly, and the group has grown significantly to the point where we now have over 70 members in the group. And membership includes representatives from all across the whelk supply chain, so from the catching sector, processing, wholesale, fishing associations and producers organisations. We have representatives from government and management organisations and also scientific researchers, so research institutes and academic. Apologies, I didn't realise I had control of the slides as well. So I'll do that now. In terms of key work areas, the Whelk Management Group is progressing work in a number of areas as determined by members. So members were initially asked to explore what the group's priorities would be and where the group should focus its attention. Key of which at the moment is the development of fisheries management plans. And I'm actually going to come back to that point. So I'll talk through the others and then I'll come back to that point because it is probably the most substantive piece of work that the Whelk Management Group has on at the moment. So in addition to FMP development and delivery, We have had discussions around post-release mortality of whelks, and off the back of discussions held at the Whelk Management Group, Professor Michael Kaiser produced best practice guidance notes on responsible handling for fishers to try and reduce that post-release mortality. We have ongoing discussions around bait provisioning, both from an economic and a sustainability point of view. The group has an overarching theme of work around data improvement, and we've had a lot of discussions around the lack of appropriate data for evidence-based management of whelk fisheries in this symposium. And this is certainly a key priority for the Whelk Management Group, and looking to ensure that regulators and researchers have all the information they need to make robust management decisions for the fishery. And this really follows two distinct themes. The one is making the best use of the information that we already have, and also making sure that the right data are gathered in the future and are gathered in a way which reduce the reporting burden on fishers. Finally, Hannah also mentioned in her presentation that a collaborative group formed through the Whelk Management Group, which successfully applied for and successfully received funding for the Fisheries Industry Science Partnership to support research into progressing the work that Hannah and Thomas are already doing on anecdotal data gathering, to undertake research on trialling different whelk pot designs to minimise the catch of juvenile whelks, and also on trialling chemical bait alternatives to reduce fisher reliance on natural baits. In terms of the FMP development work, which is probably the other key area of interest for this symposium, earlier this year, the Whelk Management Group and Seafish were actually commissioned as the delivery lead for development of DEFRA's FMP for whelk in English waters. The whelk FMP is part of DEFRA's front-runner phase. This means that it's one of the 6 FMPs prioritised for delivery in 2023, which sounds like a long time, but it's actually not. There's an awful lot of work to be done in a relatively short space of time. So as delivery lead, the Whelk Management Group and Seafish are responsible for delivering a draft FMP, which includes objectives which will deliver on the objectives laid out in the Fisheries Act 2020. We have to deliver an evidence statement for whelk fisheries in English waters, so laying out where we are at the moment in terms of current knowledge, what data assets exist, and where notable knowledge gaps exist and how they can be addressed. And we also have to develop and deliver a stakeholder engagement strategy, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. To do this, the Whelk Management Group has established 2 key working groups, the first of which is an FMP working group, which has been tasked with developing draft content to go into a fisheries management plan. And the second is a scientific subgroup, which is tasked with developing a scientific research plan. The research plan will underpin the FMP objectives and lay out more information on how the FMP can help improve whelk science and ensuring that the right research is carried out to support sustainable management of the fishery. In terms of stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned, we have to develop and deliver a stakeholder engagement plan as part of the FMP process. And the purpose of the engagement strategy, as laid out here, is to raise awareness about the FMP process among stakeholders, to ensure that the FMP is delivered collaboratively, so it's developed with input from all stakeholders, and critically here, going beyond the membership of the Whelk Management Group, so all stakeholders with an interest in the whelk fishery, and also to undertake informal engagement on draft FMPs prior to formal public consultation. So with all fisheries management plan development projects, there will be a round of formal public consultation carried out by DEFRA in early to mid 2023, but each delivery lead is tasked with carrying out informal engagement in the run-up to that to ensure there are no nasty surprises. So I'd like to just thank everyone again for the opportunity to present. I appreciate that's been a quick whistle-stop tour of the work of the Whelk Management Group. But what I would say is I've left my contact details here. I can put them into the chat as well, and these slides can be circulated if that's useful. And I would encourage any stakeholders who have an interest in either joining the Whelk Management Group or engaging in the development of the English Whelk Fisheries Management Plan. Please feel free to contact us directly, and we can take it from there. And any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lewis. That was absolutely incredible and great to get a bit of insight on the really important work that you're doing. And I'm so pleased to hear that Whelk is a priority FMP. So that's really good. And it sounds like this work will hopefully create some overarching principles that can be applied to whelk fisheries management across the UK. So thank you very much for that talk. We're now going to have a pre-recorded presentation from Joanna Massini, Policy Advisor in DEFRA's non-quota species team, and she will be talking about a recent shellfish legislation mapping tool produced by DEFRA.
Hello, my name is Joanna Massini and I am in the non-quota species team in DEFRA. I have a brief presentation for you to share with you some information about an ongoing project, the Shellfish Legislation Mapping Tool, that my colleague Matthew Johnson and I are developing in our team. Now, in its current form, the tool is a spreadsheet that contains all the legislation that we currently have across the UK for shellfish, crabs, lobsters, etc., and mollusks, whelks, cuttlefish, and so on. Initially, the spreadsheet was created to support the work of the Whelk Management Group and the Crab Management Group. When these groups were first set up, we started thinking about what sort of management measures we could introduce to protect the offshore crab, lobster, and whelk fisheries. But very quickly, we realized that we need to understand first what existing management measures we already have in place, and then identify any gaps that we may need to address. And that was the rationale behind the creation of the legislation mapping tool. Now, the blue boxes that you see in the middle of the slide show what the tool contains. EU legislation we inherited from our CFP days, and an abundance of national and local management measures divided by administrations, crown dependencies, and IFCAs. I'll show you in a minute what the tool looks like, but I would like to add at this point that the current species that we have completed in the tool focus on whelks and 3 species of crab, edible, spider, and velvet. In the next update, our plan is to include the current UK legislation that we have for lobsters, king scallops, and queenies, and cuttlefish. My colleague Matthew Johnson and I aim to update the tool on a quarterly basis, and for that we do rely indeed on the advice and kind support of our colleagues from across all UK administrations and our IFCAs. And this is what the tool looks like. It consists of 2 tables, and this is the first one. As you can see, we're trying to keep it simple with a summary at the top and a few boxes underneath. On the left-hand side, we have the title of the measure as it appears in a bylaw or a statutory instrument, and then it's followed by a brief description of what that measure contains so that the user can get the gist of it very quickly. And wherever possible, we also add a link of the legislation so that the user can delve into the detail of that measure if they need to do so. You can see that the measures are divided by jurisdiction. We start with a retained EU law, and then we have legislation in England, Scotland, and so on. But I have to emphasize, this is just a snapshot of the legislation, as the whole thing could not possibly fit on just one slide. And this is the second table, which we call the matrix. Now, it is part of the legislation mapping tool, and it complements the information on the previous slide. Now, how did it come about? Well, when we presented the legislation mapping tool to the Whelk management group, the feedback we received from the members was that the mapping tool was very useful indeed, but it would be even more helpful to have a quick snapshot of all the legislative measures, like a quick reference guide to identify quickly how frequently the various measures are used across the UK by the various administrations and also why. And so we set up this matrix table. In this particular slide, we're looking at the Whelk management measures across the UK. But again, like the previous slide, this also is a snapshot, as I couldn't feed all the measures onto one slide. Now, looking at the first measure, for example, it's the Whelk minimum landing size of 45 millimeters that is used by 8 out of 16 jurisdictions. Now, these 16 jurisdictions are EU waters, offshore English waters, followed by waters in the 3 devolved administrations, the Isle of Man, and then the 10 IFCAs. So 8 out of 16 areas where the fleet fishes for whelks. In these areas, the MLS for whelks is 45 millimeters. And in the details box, we have included the names of the areas where this particular MLS is enforced. And we did this kind of analysis for all the measures that appear in our body of legislation for shellfish in the UK. So this table and the one you saw on the previous slide are the DEFRA shellfish legislation mapping tool. As I mentioned earlier, the tool will be updated every 3 months, and we shall be able to share it with our industry groups with the support of our seafish colleagues who provide the secretariat, as you know, for the crab and whelk management groups. And I have to say that we're very grateful indeed to Aoife Martin, Louis Tattersall, Rebecca Trissy and Ella Brock for their endless support and good cheer when dealing with this particular tool. As you can understand, updating this legislation mapping tool is a painstaking long-term commitment, and we are very grateful indeed for the support that we receive from all other colleagues across the UK. If you have any comments, any thoughts, any questions, feel free to email me on shellfish@defra.gov.uk. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of this fantastic symposium. Take care. Bye now.
Thanks so much to Joanna for that pre-recorded presentation. The tool and matrix are fantastic. Joanna talked about how whelk fisheries are predominantly inshore fisheries subject to local controls and regulations, and I think it can be a minefield to figure out what measures are in place where and what they're doing. So being able to understand those, find them easily, and figure out also why those measures were chosen and their intended outcomes and impact are going to be so helpful to others maybe considering management and starting the process. So let's keep our eyes peeled for that. She said it's coming out soon, and if you do have any questions for her, as she said, please do get in direct contact with her. So next, I would like to welcome Philip Langlois, Marine and Fisheries Assistant Officer at the Government of Jersey, and he's hopefully going to be telling us about what research and management they're doing on whelk fisheries over there. Over to you, Phil.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, firstly, thanks for having me on this talk today. As just said, my name's Phil, and I work over in Jersey, assisting the team in sort of the administration of our local fishing industry. Just to give you a bit of context of what is what. So Jersey's we're a little British Crown dependency down in the Gulf of St. Malo, so we're quite close to France, and we've got a number of large offshore reefs that sort of characterise our surrounding seas. So we're relatively shallow, so lots of nice things going on. So on the first slide, sort of welcome to Jersey. So commercial fisheries for Jersey are worth around £7 million a year to the Jersey economy, and we, since back in 2007, that's when we started sort of log recording, catch recording for all our under 10s and over 10 meter boats, and the chart that we see there is the landed quantity of whelks, which we've recorded since 2007. As you can see, it's varied significantly over time, due to various reasons such as the number of vessels in the fleet, as well as various management restrictions, and so on. The most notable decrease in the last couple of years has been down to Jersey's designation as a third country status, so we can no longer land directly into Europe. That said, whelks are important to our fleet. Shellfish themselves account for about 85% of total landed weight, and of the total landed weight, whelks account for around 17% of this. Back in 2020, we had 200 tons landed, with a market value of around £240,000. This is down from 2018, where we had about 800 tons landed, with a market value of around 800 tons. As you can see, the variability in sort of landings, landed weight of whelks over time, sort of there's been good years, bad years, and it's been following very much a sort of boom bust sort of fisheries over here. There's boats come in, boats leave, but for the most part, it's there. Just moving on. So at the moment, we've got about 30 to 40 boats that are sort of target whelks within Jersey waters. About 3 to 7 of these are Jersey boats. The rest are mainly French vessels. Compared to other places, I believe the Jersey whelk fishery is relatively recent. It's only sort of been going on since the early 90s. And with a number of boats, the Jersey fleet itself is sort of characterized by a small number of vessels that can potentially catch quite large amounts, ranging from 0.9 to 1.4 tons, whereas the French fleet is comprised of a higher number of vessels, and they can catch a lower amount, normally up to 900 kilos. And like the landings on the previous page, the LPUE has varied over time. So in the Gulf of St. Malo, where we're located, that sort of represents the sort of southern edge of the whelks range. So that does sort of limit their ability to repopulate if they're overfished in any of the areas around here. And we're under the opinion that the whelk stock in Jersey itself is under a noticeable amount of pressure. So as I described on the previous slide, that was the Jersey data. Going forward, we are going to be receiving French data under the terms of the TCA, and we have started collating this information, but we have only just begun. It's estimated at the moment that French landings for whelks are in the region of around 6,000 tons, whereas from Jersey waters that anywhere from 800 to 1,500 tons can be caught each year, representing a ballpark figure of around 12 to 25% of total French landings. This sort of highlights the importance of French as Jersey waters in the French fisheries. As you can see by the image on the bottom right-hand side of the slide there. So this slide is current management measures. I won't walk through everything, but they are fairly standard, sort of minimum landing size, pot numbers, vessel size, and all that. Two things I will talk a little bit more on in depth are the pot tag system we have in place, as well as various closed areas. So back in 2019, Marine Resources undertook a consultation with the industry about where they'd like to see the whelk fishery head and what direction it would like to take. And one key element of that was a closed area on the southeast of Jersey in the 0 to 3 mile limit. And the purpose of this was to protect what is considered a good fishing ground by the fleet. So this was sort of an area that was self-imposed upon themselves because they believed it to be a good fishing area. And another result of this 2019 consultation was the introduction of pot tags. So it was originally agreed that there'd be 9,000 pot tags that form a pool that we would issue in batches of 30 to the fleet. And to sort of protect the 0 to 3 and prevent overfishing within that area, there'd be an 1,800 pot tag limit within that area. And then going out into the 3 to 12, again, there'd be limits on 900 pots per vessel. So locally in Jersey waters, there's a number of style of pots that are used. Jersey boats will tend to use the style of pot you see on the top right hand side, a plastic pot with lead weights inside, whereas the French fleet will typically use the style of pot you see on the bottom right, basically a black plastic pot with either a concrete or metal base. And what we've done in the last couple of years is we have been trialing both of these to see if there have been any differences between the two. Catch data between the two is relatively similar in terms of undersized and oversized whelks. However, the French style of pot does have a higher weight of bycatch in the form of dog whelks. It's important to note when we're looking at the illustration that we've got there, the area that we did do these surveys on was from a relatively unexploited area. That's why we're still seeing sort of 3, 4, 5 kilos per pot. So the main research that we do into whelks locally is our annual whelk trials. So since 1996, we've done these annual stock assessments, which have been carried out. So we've been able to sort of document the change of local stocks in and around Jersey. Because the trials themselves started in conjunction with the fishery, the population has been relatively well monitored from a time where they were in an unexploited state around the 1999 to 2004. And at that point, it wasn't uncommon for vessels to turn over gear twice in a single day. Obviously, that's unexploited state can't continue in forever. So eventually, this sort of settled into a stable, exploited state with catch rates remaining relatively similar over time. Catch rates from our trials have, again, like I said, stayed roughly the same over time for the last 15 years. But it's in the last 5 years that we've started to notice a change in composition. So the total weight has remained the same, but the number of the weight per pot of large whelks, sized whelks, has been decreasing, and we have been noticing an increase in the smaller undersized whelks to sort of make up that difference. So the last batch of trials that we undertook were in February this year, and the main takeaway from that is that the samples themselves were varied between locations. We normally sort of characterize the sites sort of into two groups: a northern site, Group B, and a southern site, Group A. And then we normally do them one at a time before changing between sites. It's important to, pardon me, say, like I was saying, some sites are different. Some sites, such as E2, there is almost no whelks present, whereas some other sites are still relatively healthy. In this instance, E5 receives very low efforts. And this is due to them being conceived sort of as dirty whelks. There's a lot of growth on the shells, where some of the other sites, such as D5 and D6, represent some of the more well-fished sites. Recently, what we started doing is taking subsamples of all of these locations, normally a pot or a fixed percentage of the whelks caught, and from them we measure and record their lengths. So what we see on this slide here is essentially all the data from this exercise that we've done. And we can see that there's a sort of a general decrease in the number of larger whelks and a higher frequency of smaller whelks, and that leftward movement in terms of size. This sort of again highlights the changing pot composition that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. And the plan is that we will be continuing these measurements for the next couple of years, so we can start building up a data set to see if we can observe any emerging patterns. And then hopefully this will be able to guide us in any management guides that we take. So just sort of building on from the previous one. So the previous slide showed all of the data, but it's not representative of what is happening at each sample location. So what we've got here is sort of the breakdown of 3 sites. We've got a northern site, an eastern site, and a southern site. This sort of the change that we're seeing here sort of suggests that we have a number of numerous smaller populations locally rather than one sort of Jersey population. In this instance, with the 3 sites, the northern sites had an almost complete absence of larger whelks with an increased number of smaller whelks. The eastern site, D5, which is located inside the 3, had reduced size frequencies across the range, but again, a greater number of smaller whelks. Whereas some sites, such as E5, the southern site, in this instance, remained relatively unchanged. And again, these measurements will continue for the next couple of years to build up that data set that we have. So just to finish off, obviously with our proximity to France, Brexit has presented a number of issues, mainly being that Jersey's now been given a third country status, which prevents direct landings into Europe. So that catch is now predominantly limited to the local market in Jersey itself, with some exports via the UK, but these are difficult for the boats that only catch, say, 30 kilos a day. And hopefully in the near future we will be able to compensate for this. There's a number of future issues that we are looking at with concern. For example, seawater change. Whelks need a certain temperature to spawn, we all know this. And with sea temperature rising around Jersey quite noticeably, we've seen. We think this may have an impact on recruitment, which we will be monitoring. Gear conflict is an issue that, again, that's ongoing. The whelk ground I have around here occupy areas that are used by other métiers, scallop dredging, spider netting, and so on. So we'll need to address this so we can avoid conflict between various métiers. And then, as I mentioned previously, because of third country status, the market issues and export issues in relation to Brexit remain of concern. Hopefully we'll be able to find a solution to this as well. That is my last slide. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Philip. The annual Whelk trials are a really impressive data set and highlights the importance of long-term data in helping us to understand pressures on stocks and whether that's from fishing or other factors. I hadn't realised that the Gulf of St Malo presents the southern edge of the Whelk's range. That's really cool. I've learned something new today. And as you said, I think sounds like climate change will definitely impact the stocks in this region if that's the case. So thank you so much. And it's so wonderful to hear about what's happening over in Jersey. We don't hear enough of it, I feel. So thank you for that presentation. We now have presentations from some of the IFCAs in England on the research and management measures that they've introduced. We're going to start with Sarah Clark, Deputy Chief Officer for Devon and Severn IFCA, who's going to give us an overview of the research undertaken in the district to inform whelk management. Over to you, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Morven. Yes, as Morven said, I'm just going to run through the whelk management that we've introduced in Devon and Severn, and that was determined by some research we did on the size of section maturity of whelk. So I hope all my slides aren't missing at the bottom, but yeah, this is just a summary of the sort of landings that we have. This is from 2018. And you can see that we have 3 major landing ports within our district: Ilfracombe on the north coast, Exmouth and Brixham. And boats to Ilfracombe and Exmouth tend to work mostly in the inshore area, whereas Brixham has a mixture of those boats operating within our district and outside. And you can see that they're quite large landings for all those ports. So I just wanted to give you an idea of the changes in landings between 2012 and 19. And as others have mentioned, there was an increase really up to about 2015. And then gradually, both in Ilfracombe and in Exmouth, we've seen declining landings, you know, from, for example, in Ilfracombe, 716 tonnes in 2014, 874 in 15, down to 228 in 2019. So there has been a decline in our fisheries. So management prior to 2018, as we've heard, it's a non-quota species. We had no close season. We were following the EU minimum conservation reference size of 45 millimetres. But we have introduced our adaptive permit bylaw permit conditions for potting and other activities in our district, which will allow for future changes in management. And just to mention the Lyme Bay Reserve, which was sort of instigated by Blue Marine, they set a voluntary code within our district of 500 pots maximum and 30 pots per string. So CFAS did some research some years back looking at the size of section maturity, which is the probability of an individual being, or the size at which 50% of the population is sexually mature. And they did 2 samples, one on the north coast at Ilfracombe and one at Exmouth. And you can see the size of sexual maturity of whelks in that table. So in order to gather more data and to build on CFAS's work, we decided to get more accurate estimates of size of sexual maturity over a longer period of time. And we also wanted to look at whether a minimum size could be based on shell width rather than shell height, and also to identify peak breeding and spawning times within our district. So we met with the fishing industry in both North and South Devon. We talked about the fishery, and they raised their concerns about the fishery and their general support for some additional measures to help protect the sort of boom and bust fishery that others have identified today. And we had 3 skippers who volunteered to collect samples for us in Exmouth, Ilfracombe, and a few extra samples from Start Bay, where one fisher was concerned that perhaps the population was of a smaller size and maturing at a smaller size. And I just want to make a mention to Catherine Stevenson, who's now with Natural England. She did a lot of this work. I think she's on the Symposium, but she did a lot of the research when she was with the IFCA. So what do? We collected samples over a 12-month period, and then we analysed sub-samples for the size and sexual maturity, and also did some width and height metric data collection. So assessing maturity, this is the protocol that CFAS used, and they actually trained us in this methodology. And it was really to identify the mature gonads. And this is for females. And you can see on the picture B that the gonads are really mature and they're yellow, and they are very sort of differentiated from the digestive whorl as opposed to the immature female. And then if we look at the males, you can again see the differentiation of the gonads, the bright red gonads, and also the enlarged penis on the fully developed mature male. And so the results, well, we did the results. So we did the sampling for Exmouth and Ilfracombe and a few samples from Start Bay. And this is the results that we found. You've got size of sexual maturity for both males and females around 70 millimetres in Exmouth. Sorry, there we go. And slightly larger in Ilfracombe at about 76 millimetres. and slightly smaller in Start Bay as identified by the fisher at about sort of, as you can see, females at 58 millimeters and the males at 64. So we also had a look at the seasonality of the reproductive cycle, and what you can see here is the gonad index increases with gonad size as they mature and then declines after copulation and spawning. So you can see that the male peak is slightly earlier than the female peak, then there's copulation and then the gonads decline, and that peak is in October for Exmouth, and the females is slightly later with the spawning from after December. Unfortunately, we didn't get any samples for January that year because of the weather conditions. And then for females again, for Ilfracombe, again, slightly not as clear as the Exmouth picture, but you can see again the decline in the gonad size for males and for females. And we also had a look at the shell height and shell width, and we looked at the minimum width and the maximum width, and you can see the two charts in front of you, and there was a sort of significant correlation in both, a little bit more in the maximum width and shell height. So all this information really provided us with some conclusions and recommendations for management. So it's obvious from the work that we did that the 55 millimeter MCRS, the EU size, was insufficient to protect the spawning stock. And those are the figures we got from the 3 areas within our district. So it suggests that recruitment overfishing may have been occurring, and that an increase in the minimum conservation reference size will help the fishery to be more sustainable. So we looked at the minimum size based on shell width, which is possible to introduce or to be used for guidance for the fishers to set their riddle width. And also there's a potential for a closed season during peak reproductive activity. So actually, through our bylaw and permitting subcommittee, the IFCA decided to increase the minimum conservation reference size to 65 millimeters, but over a sort of phased approach, with 10 millimeter increase in 2018 and then a further 10 millimeter increase in 2020. And this was done through our permit conditions of our permit bylaws in potting and other fishing activities. And this gives you an idea. The table shows you the percentage of the samples that mature at each shell height. And you can see even with the increase up to 65, we're not protecting all the populations that we sampled. But we did a phased approach to reduce the immediate impact on the industry. And we used the data actually to provide guidance to the industry on the relationship between shell height and width, so that they could aid their setting of the riddle spacing and escape holes, so that a minimum amount of undersize is retained, but also a minimum amount of sizable catch is lost. And future work, well, what we'd like to do is to assess the impact of the management measures that we've introduced, and also potentially to review the spawning period, but we would need to gather a little bit more information on that, but we could do that through our permit conditions. And that's me finished. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. The research that you've done in Devon and Severn IFCA, it's just incredible, and I think very pioneering, and really highlights the differences between populations at what you would think maybe might be quite small scales, and the value of adaptive permit bylaws. So thank you so much for bringing that to life. And if anyone has further questions for Sarah, please do put them in the chat, or I'm sure she wouldn't mind you getting in touch directly. So I'd now like to welcome George Balchin, Fisheries and Conservation Research Officer with Sussex IFCA, who's going to be talking about their shellfish permitting bylaw and the trends in the Sussex whelk fishery. Over to you, George.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the introduction. I am George Balchin, and I'm the new Fisheries and Conservation Research Officer at Sussex IFCA. Thank you very much to Blue and Sam for inviting us to this talk. It's been really good and some great work going on. Thank you to everyone else for their talks. It's been really interesting, and I'll be trying to make some modest contribution to the discussion by talking about our shellfish permit bylaw and some of the sort of spatiotemporal trends that have come out of the data from the catch returns. Do I have control of these slides? Cool. So just give you a quick overview. I'll be talking about the Shellfish Permit Bylaw, just to give some context to the rest of the talk. All of the data that I'll be presenting has come from the catch returns from that bylaw. We'll talk about some temporal trends, both yearly and seasonal, and move on to the spatial distribution of the fishery, and talk about IC squares and ports. And finally finish with the traditional take-home messages, and so to talk a little bit about where we think this data collection exercise is going. So the Shellfish Permit Bylaw was introduced in 2005, applies to the commercial and recreational fisheries, and includes cuttlefish, edible crab, whelk, prawn, spider crab, velvet swimming crab, and of course whelk. There is a recreational limit on edible crab and lobster. It's 5 crab and 2 lobster, and above this per day, and above that limit, you are required to purchase a commercial permit, which costs £200 plus the cost of tags, and included in the bylaw are pot restrictions. So for crab and lobster, this is 300 within 3 nautical miles, and 300 additional pots within 3 to 6 nautical miles. It's exactly the same for whelk, and for cuttlefish, it's 300 pots within the 6 nautical miles. There are escape hole restrictions, which are of a defined size, a defined number in a defined place, and this applies to both crab and lobster and whelk pots. And the sort of whelk specific measure is that all whelks are required to go through a 25mm riddle. This is to ensure that they meet the 45mm minimum size. And I thought it was important to say that this bylaw is flexible. It states in the bylaw it's flexible. So, for example, there are no restrictions on bait, and various other things. But it's sort of puts the IFCA in a position to be able to react to changes in the fishery in real time, or like relatively speaking in real time. And just to say that the whelk fishery is quite important in Sussex, and I actually learned today from Andreas talk from the MMO that nationally important as well. And so you can see that the landings of whelk sort of dwarf, total landings dwarf any other pot fishery. And it is the catch returns data from the commercial returns that I'll be presenting today. But worth mentioning the recreational permit bylaw also, which costs £10 per year. Like I said, there is a max of 2 lobster and 5 crab per day. The pot restrictions are 5 lobster and crab, 5 whelk, 5 prawn and 2 cuttlefish. The 25mm riddle still applies, and again, those recreational permit holders are required to submit catch returns, but it's the commercial stuff that I'll be focusing on today. So moving on to year-on-year trends, there was quite a significant jump, almost 50, well, I think it's just over 50% from 2018 to 2019. This was followed by a dip in 2020 for obvious reasons, and then a sort of modest but not insignificant recovery in 2021. So this is total landing, sorry, I should have said. And moving on to efforts, followed a similar pattern again. Came down in 2020 due to COVID, and a sort of, again, a modest but noticeable recovery. Our landings per unit effort, slightly different, has actually increased throughout the study period, or at least between 2018 and 2020, leveling off between 2020 and 2021. And sort of looking at these 3 plots together, we can see that increase in landings per unit effort sort of shored up the fishery against a reduction in effort related to COVID-19, and so sort of, I guess, add some robustness to the fishery. And it's also just to think about why it is that landings per unit effort has actually increased. It'd be nice to think this is something to do with the management that's been introduced, but I think we need more data longer term with more detail to sort of say anything for sure. Moving on to seasonal trends, I don't think there's anything particularly surprising here in the first 2 plots. It peaks in between January and April due to the inshore migration, with very few landings between August and October. And this is reflected in the effort. So very few pots between August and October, and with the majority of the effort sort of existing between January and April. However, again, landings per unit effort slightly more consistent across the year. Deaths dips in sort of that same period where effort and landings dip, but proportionally speaking, not to the same extent. So again, thinking about these, all this information in conjunction, we can see that the dip in landings, the dip in total landings is not necessarily due to a dip in landings, or at least not entirely due to a dip in landings per unit effort, and it could be more attributed to effort. And I think that this could indicate, not necessarily, but again, we need more data, but this could indicate that there's some kind of like temporal refuge for whelk in Sussex, which would be good news. And again, perhaps that dip in effort is partly because the fishery sort of moves offshore in those months, which again, I don't think is particularly surprising to anyone. So moving on to the spatial distribution, it's 2 times higher in the middle of the district, in the 2 middle ICES rectangles. And why this is, I'll come on to in a minute. Again, effort, this should actually say, I realized today, this should say it doesn't match schoolboy error, but so actually we can see that total landings in F0 West is higher, but actually effort is lower. And again, this is due to landings per unit effort, with actually a 0.6 increase in the middle eastern rectangle F0 West compared to E9 East. And so once again, thinking about all of these plots together, we can see that there is lower effort but higher yield in F0 West, and maybe this is due to a locally stronger stock. I think some people today have spoken about fine scale spatial differences in the strength of stock or the size of population, so it could be something to do with that. But yeah, again, more sophisticated analysis or more data required. And so moving on to spatial distribution in terms of ports, so I sort of included this just to explain the difference between those 2 middle ICES rectangles. So Shoreham and Eastbourne, which again I learned from Andrea's from the MMO's talk today, are sort of nationally significant ports, and dwarf any other ports in the district in terms of landings, with a sort of similar total landings between Shoreham and Eastbourne. However, Eastbourne, the effort in Eastbourne is notably lower. And again, I think this the very similar landings but difference in effort is of course explained by landings per unit effort. And again, I think it's interesting to think about why this is. Is it due to difference in the size of populations or the strength of the stock? Yeah. Moving on, sorry, again, that was, I sort of showed this slide previously, but thinking about it all together, I think that it's safe to say that the differences and the similarities between the IC squares are essentially driven by the ports in those IC squares. So I thought it'd be just important to explain that. Okay, so moving on to my take-home messages. The first of all is that the whelk fishery in Sussex is important and growing. So you can see that this is the value in millions in, I believe, 2019. And again, whelk sort of dwarfing the other potting-based fisheries in the district. And also that the whelk fishery is growing relative to the other potting fisheries. So you can see on the lower plot that the percentage of whelk pots relative to cuttle and lobster and crab pots is increasing and has increased throughout the study period. And yeah, like I said, a small number of ports are driving the fishery. And interestingly, that effort is not always strongly associated with landings per unit effort. And why that is, I'm not exactly sure, but I thought it'd be interesting to point out. And finally, that we feel that the Shellfish permit bylaw is working quite well. In large part, that's because of the amount of data that it generates. So the commercial side of the landings, the catch returns database is currently about 45,000 rows, so like quite a bit of data there. And what we'll be looking to do going forward is sort of doing some slightly more sophisticated analysis, which will hopefully tease out some of those questions that I've included today. And that's actually my last slide. So thank you very much for listening, and I invite any questions.
Thanks very much, George. That was excellent. Really good to understand the significance of the fishery in the region and for the UK as a whole. I imagine your work and the work that other IFCAs are doing is feeding into the fish management plans, and maybe some of the fishing ports or fishermen who are in your district, clearly very dependent on whelks, are also being able to feed into that process. So yeah, really great to get a bit of a different perspective. So thank you. Finally, I'd like to welcome Annabelle Plumeridge, Senior Scientist at Northwestern IFCA, previously at Kent and Essex IFCA as a science officer, who will be giving us 2 consecutive presentations. We're really lucky. She's firstly going to talk about determining a minimum landing size using size and age for whelks in Kent and Essex, and then she's going to give us a presentation on the implementation of new whelk management in Northwestern IFCA district. So thank you, Annabelle, and I will hand over to you.
Hi, yeah, I'm sorry you've got me twice. We'll see what I can do. So in this first presentation, I will focus on the research work undertaken by Kent and Essex IFCA and how we determined an effective minimum landing size for whelks in the district. Over the past sort of 4 years at Kent and Essex, they've undertaken a substantial amount of research into the size and age of maturity of whelks in the district, and also looking at the effectiveness of riddling and improving our approach to enforcement. So just to give a bit of background context, in 2009, we saw landings in the district increase 25-fold from 43 tonnes to 1,100 tonnes per year in 2012, and it sustained sort of around that level. So it's likely influenced by global factors that we're all fairly familiar with the ease in which people can enter the fishery and the minimum restrictions that are applied to them. Also, specifically in the district, there was an increase in nomadic vessels coming in and fishing a large number of pots, so well over 1,000 pots. We were kind of becoming aware as well at the same time that the national minimum landing size of 45 millimetres wasn't providing enough protection, which is commonplace or concern around the UK. And because of this rapid increase in landings and the potential for recruitment overfishing that we were seeing, we introduced an emergency bylaw in 2013. So the main aim of the bylaw introduced was to, I guess, limit effort by some means and also monitor activity. So fishers were then required to have a permit. They were also to provide catch returns. They were limited to 300 pots, which kind of removed this nomadic vessel issue that was going on. We also specified that the use of a riddle and that the spacings between these bars would be, originally it was in 2013, and when it became a fixed bylaw, it was 22 millimetres, which corresponded with a 45 millimetre whelk, but later we increased it to 25, which then correlates with a 53 millimetre whelk within our district. Throughout this presentation, I might flip between talking about 25 millimetres and 53 millimetres in length and width. This is because we originally had it as 25 and then translated it to 53 millimetres in length for clarification for fishers, but I'll discuss that later on. We also introduced escape gaps, but to ensure that we were specifying an effective riddle size, one thing we needed to do was identify the size at which whelks reach maturity. So we undertook some studies to essentially find out what this is. So over the past few years, we've done 2 complementary studies, and I'll be presenting both together. The figure here shows our district and the sample sites within that. So areas 1 to 4, which were done in the initial study by Dr. Phil Holliman in 2017, where he took 50 whelks from each site. And then the second study, which was just in area 1, which we call Essex, and area 2, which was Kent. Kent is one of the main fishing grounds in the district. We then did a European Marine funded project in that area, where we wanted to look at the difference between Kent and Essex in particular, because Phil's research had highlighted that even though they were I think maybe like 13 kilometers apart, there is still a 10 millimeter difference in the size at maturity. So for that project, we took 5 samples every month over the course of 2 years, and in total dissected over 12,000 whelks. So as part of this research, we had a number of main research questions, all which have kind of been covered by other IFCAs. I think everyone has been having a similar research. One just being, what's the size distribution and average size of whelks between the different areas? What's the relationship between weight and length? So do whelks in different parts of the district put on more or less weight per millimetre of growth? Would you get more yield from one population of whelks than another? A key research objective obviously was to determine size at maturity. We also wanted to get a clear view of their reproductive cycles. So where in the year did they reproduce, and getting samples over 2 years allowed us to do this. Another question we had, which turned out to be a pretty critical one, which was finding out at what age whelks reach maturity. And this was one of our most interesting findings and influenced how we assess the effectiveness of riddle sizes at protecting immature whelks. We then wanted to look at location. So how do all of the above questions differ for whelks across the district? And lastly, based on all of this, we wanted to know, is our management appropriate? And is the current riddle size providing enough protection to our juvenile stocks? So for starters, just looking at the key main, like two sites, we found that size distribution for both was significantly different. And those that were, we also looked at so the red on these graphs and the blue shows immature and mature, and we found a greater percentage of immature whelks were protected in area 1 than area 2, which is possibly expected given that their size is slightly smaller, and that their size at maturity was also slightly smaller. On the graph as well, you can see that the vertical lines will show you where the national minimum landing size and our Kent and Essex's minimum landing size sit. So you can see where on that, anything to the right is retained and protected under each respective minimum landing size regulation. So for Kent in particular, only 31% of immature individuals were being protected under the national regs, but this increased to 66 under our minimum landing size introduced at 53. Also, just briefly, these graphs on the right side show the relationship of length of a whelk with their total weight, their foot weight, and their width. So we wanted to ask, does one whelk from Kent put on more weight per millimetre, than a whelk from Essex? Does it also have a similar yield? And we also wanted to know whether the length-width relationship was the same for between the sites, because we want to know, we're applying a riddle size across the whole district, and we want to know that it has a uniform effect in sorting whelks. And we don't want to, because we manage them under a single stock unit, we don't want to penalise any fishers from one part of the district or another. So it turns out that despite Kent on average being slightly larger, both populations of whelk did have a similar length-weight relationship and length-width relationship as well. Okay, so one of the main aims of the project was to determine size at maturity, and this was done in both studies, first by Phil Hollyman, and then again as part of our European Marine funded project, where we just hope to validate Phil's results because he took a smaller number and only at a set time of the year. So the graph shows size at maturity calculation for whelks from both sites, which is combined, again, because we just want to look at it as a single management stock unit. But we did also have a look at the differences in size at maturity between males and females and between sites. Our results did luckily match up with Phil's and helped build confidence in his results. But it also highlighted that we didn't need to do such excessive sampling. And I really wish I'd known that at the beginning of the project before I had to do 12,000 whelks. But perhaps the biggest takeaway from this work was considering the age at which whelks reach maturity and how critical this is at determining an appropriate minimum landing size. So in Phil's work, we looked at statolith, or he looked at statolith analysis. And that's the kind of main method in which he used to age them across the district. And then he was able to calculate growth curves, and you can see that by the different colours on the graph for the different areas. For each of the 4 areas, it was demonstrated that it takes between 2.7 to 3 years for a whelk to reach size at maturity. Ultimately, what we want, though, is for a whelk to have bred at least once before it is removed from the population. So the potential here is that a whelk might reach size at maturity in its 3rd year, which you can see on the graph, but if it's removed from the population before the breeding season, it's likely that it's not contributed to the following year's recruitment cohort, because in the previous year's breeding season, there was only, a 10 to 20% chance it could have been mature. So what we wanted to do is allow them to grow for another year. And if we did that, then by the time they're 4 years old, in the previous breeding season, there would have been a 50 to 70% chance that they would have bred at least once. So when we compared our 53mm landing size, which on the graph is a 25, because at the time we were still doing it in width, you see that it gets us to this 4-year-old threshold, and it's likely that the whelks would have, a larger proportion of whelks would have been allowed to breed at least once before they're removed. And this is quite an interesting sort of methods paper in its own right. So these graphs here just show a comparison, this kind of to reiterate the point, between the proportion of whelks classed as mature versus those that have actually reproduced in the same sample of whelks. So green is mature, and blue is the ones that have reproduced for both Area 1, so Essex, and Area 2 in Kent. And you can see there's a significantly smaller number of whelk that have actually reproduced at least once in the population compared to those that have we would consider as mature. So it helps again to show that increasing our minimum landing size to 53 helped protect a greater proportion of those which hadn't yet reproduced. So finally, as this comes under the management section as well, I just wanted to mention a bit about how our management changed, not just as a result of the findings of our research, but also through our interaction with fishers. So essentially, all this research is irrelevant if not implemented correctly. And initially, our enforcement procedures involved riddling the catch at the quayside when carrying out inspections. And we found that was actually included in part of our bylaw, that it had to be passed over a 25mm riddle. And riddling is never 100% effective. So when we re-riddled, we found that some whelks still fell through, and fishers weren't happy with this, and it was proving a bit difficult enforcement wise. And also because they had actually followed the rules of the bylaw, but also fishers didn't understand that the riddle size of 25mm width translated to 53mm in length. So they weren't happy. They thought they were throwing back whelks. They saw that they were throwing back whelks that were actually at greater than 45mm, which was the national landing size. So to address this, we decided to translate this 25mm width into a 50mm length in our bylaw. And also, instead of riddling when we landed them, we used stop-go gauges for inspections, and that has kind of cleared up some of the issues that we had. So that's the summary of Kent and Essex's work on whelks so far. I can move straight on.
Yes, thanks so much, Annabelle. Yeah, take it away for the next presentation.
Okay, so there's a little bit less to say here. It's actually very timely, this symposium in terms of for Northwest IFCA, because new regulations for our whelk management came in the last 2 weeks. So, at this stage, we're very early in our management. So it's probably best I just take you through our previous regulations and the difficulties we've had with these, and how they've changed now and what we intend to do in the future. So Up until recently, this district was managed under the Whelk's fishery in the district was managed under 2 different bylaws, split across what was old sea fisheries boundaries. So for anyone who's sort of not too familiar with IFCAs, they were originally called sea fisheries committees, and then when the IFCAs were formed for Northwest IFCA, we had Cumbria and Northwest combined to make Northwestern Inshore Fisheries Authority. So one half of the district, the southern half, was you could fish for whelks there. They were managed under one particular bylaw, but in the northern half, in the Cumbria, they couldn't. And the reason for this was because of a specification in the old Cumbria bylaw, where all pots had to have that used for potting had to have an escape gap of 70 or 75 millimeters, which was related to crab and lobster. But unfortunately, the wording meant that it also applied to whelk pots, and therefore an escape gap of this size meant it wasn't really possible for whelk fishermen to fish in this way. In addition, we were also still operating under this national minimum landing size of 45 millimeters, which we were aware is highly unlikely to be effective at protecting juvenile stock. So when introducing these new regulations and opening up what is effectively in the white portion of the Cumbria coastline, potentially new fishing grounds, it was important that we limited effort in some way. So to do this, we decided to introduce a track record scheme. So applicants looking to apply for a whelk permit under the new scheme could apply for 400 pots or 1,000 pots, but they were only granted the maximum number of 1,000 if they could prove a legitimate interest by way of historical landings and fishing within the track record area. So the track record area on the map is all the red dot area. Obviously, it couldn't be applied to Cumbria because they weren't originally fishing in that area. We also looked at seismic maturity research in the Irish Sea and from CFAS work across the UK, which indicated that the seismic maturity of whelk in that region was likely to be over 75 millimeters. And given that this is significantly bigger than the current 45 regulations, we decided to consult with fishers to determine whether, would they prefer a straight increase or an incremental increase annually over 3 years. So it's not such a huge jump from 45 to 75 plus potentially. So yeah, as of last Monday, we've had a new permitting scheme which introduces a bylaw which applies to the whole district and brings in consistent regulation. It limits effort by limiting pots, but also the people who applied for the whelk track record, there was a cutoff limit. So now it's a closed system. The number of people who have been awarded a permit, no one can be added to that currently, potentially in future, but at least for the next year and a half, it's only going to be the number of people who got their application in by the deadline. And we've also introduced escape gaps of an appropriate size this time, with relation to also, with relation to the minimum landing size, so the escape gaps are of an appropriate size, but also we have introduced this incremental increase from starting at 55 and going up to 75 by 10 millimeters per year for the 3 years. So although this is all in its infancy and its very early stages, I haven't got any research as such to show you for Northwest IFCA. I do think that it's quite exciting and offers a really unique opportunity for opening new ground, is a potential to really a rare insight to look at a baseline assessment of what would maybe be virgin stock. And we're looking to put a new research plan together to develop over the coming months, collecting some of the initial landings data and samples from fishers as they start to enter this ground and go prospecting and see what they find. We'll of course be doing research on seismic maturity, and we'll also see if we can get some collaborative projects going with the fishers to see if they can inform us of anything that they find interesting. So yeah, that's that for Northwest IFCA, a bit of a breeze through.
Thanks so much, Annabelle, for 2 fascinating talks. I think doing 2 talks means you get 2 ice creams in the sun after the symposium, so well done you.
Thanks.
I really agree with you that the work in Northwestern IFCA provides an opportunity to inform future fisheries management and also maybe inform how we manage emerging fisheries in areas where they maybe weren't before. So again, so important for these fish management plans that we've been hearing about. I'm always blown away by the work the IFCAs do and the quality of their research. And I think all of the IFCA talks we've just heard about give some really good examples of regional approaches to management underpinned by best practice. So thank you, Sarah, George and Annabelle. And thank you also, Philip and Lewis, for your excellent presentations. I'll now hand over to Jacob to chair the Q&A and open forum discussion. Thanks all.
Thank you, Morven, and thank you to all our presenters. So just before we go into the Q&A, you'll see a poll appearing on your screen, which we'll use later on to kick off discussions. It's all about how you would like to be engaged in the development of the Whelk Fisheries Management Plan in the future, which is your preferred choice, basically. So do take a chance to do that either now or at some point during the Q&A. So moving into the Q&A, we have a couple of questions first from anonymous attendees. The first one asks, and anyone please feel free to come in on this, it asks if there's any evidence that stock numbers of bait species like crab affect fishing effort for whelk, or is the bait species varied enough that it doesn't affect the whelk fishery? Do any of our speakers have any insight on that? Feel free to just pop your hand up either digitally. Lewis, over to you.
I think this may be directed at me. As far as I'm aware, there's no evidence to suggest that stock status of other species has any impact on whelk fishing effort, because fishers largely use crab waste from processing sector. So we primarily approach this from an economic point of view, where obviously the catch of crab does affect the price of bait ultimately, and the scarcity of bait pushes up the price. So we primarily approached it from an economic point of view. There are, of course, sustainability considerations, both in terms of bait being put back into the water, but also concerns have been raised through the whelk management group and the crab management group about the potential risk of landings of soft crab to be used as bait in the whelk fishery. But a couple of things, this was considered to be a very localized issue, and introduction of legislation has, in the last few months, I think, has prohibited that. And there's also the Sea Fisheries Act 1967 also puts restrictions on when crabs can be landed, although it's maybe a little bit more open to interpretation. I mean, if anyone is aware of evidence of that, then we'd be really keen to know about it. But certainly through the whelk management group, the lens they were looking at it through was the cost of bait and impact on the fishery.
Okay, thank you very much, Lewis. I don't see anyone else wanted to come in on that. That sounds fab. Thank you very much. We have a question here for Philip. Oh, hi, Philip. I can just see you've appeared. Attendee asks, what can Jersey do to tackle the future issues that you mentioned with the whelk fishery, particularly around gear conflict and the third country status with regards to Brexit?
No, that's a good question. Unfortunately, that's not my my area of expertise over here. But what we are sort of doing at the moment, we are in sort of the evidence gathering stage. So we're sort of documenting when there's examples of gear conflicts, as well as conflict with the environment. And we have been ordered by the sort of states of Jersey to sort of come up with a marine spatial management plan that will sort of encompass this information, as well as take into account first-hand accounts of everything that's been going on. And hopefully it's the marine spatial plan that will sort of address this and allow us to move forward with that. As with the third country status, that is our situation at the moment. That's sort of outside of my remit as well. That's more of a I think it's down to politics rather than something that I can address at this time.
Understood. Thanks very much, Philip. I can see we've got a question in the chat from Sarah Birchenough. for either Sarah or Annabelle. And so Sarah, feel free to unmute and ask that.
Thanks. I was just curious where you've got a minimum size that applies across an area that's got different differences in the size distribution, but with a sort of single increase in minimum size. Have you found that any resulting differences in what's able to be legally landed by fishers operating in areas with different size distributions has caused any conflict between fishers, or indeed has led to any displacement of activity from areas where they could legally land less to where they could legally land more? Just curious. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Would Sarah Clark like to come in on that?
I mean, this is something that I had to do a whistle-top tour on my presentation, but we haven't yet done that sort of monitoring of the whelk fishery, and I think that's what we're looking to do in the future, to look at the impact of increasing it by 20 millimetres, in particular in the area of Start Bay, where you see that the size was actually smaller. So that's something we want to do, but haven't yet had an opportunity to do that with resources. But it might be that Annabelle can answer that a little bit better than I can if she's done further monitoring.
I think what we found is, so we had a difference in size at maturity between Essex and Kent, but when we actually looked at age, that increase was less, that increase impacted the Essex less severely than we thought it did, and perhaps meant that Kent needed a bit more. So we found the middle ground. And again, this is the problem with managing it it has to be managed as a unit, because I think it's virtually impossible to apply one batch of management to essentially a patch of whelks that is 10 kilometers apart from another, to be able to monitor that, or know that in landings that's what we were seeing, that they'd be recording exactly what they're doing. I don't think that would be possible. So yeah, also weighted slightly on the fact that Kent is a significant ground where a large number, hundreds of thousands of tons of whelks come off that ground in a year, in comparison to Essex, which isn't really that much. So I think maybe a number of those factors have to go in to be able to deciding, what your minimum landing size would be.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks both. And we have another question for Annabelle from Thomas Cameron. So Thomas, feel free to ask.
Hi, Annabelle, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
How are you? Good to see you, thank you. So I guess this was this about the Thames, really, which you're calling Kent, that North Kent area. I see another question in the chat as well, and it might be part of this, but this growth rate, it was really nice to see the age-based analysis that you presented, and all of three of the other Essex and Kent areas seem to cluster on a similar growth rate, but this Thames growth rate was completely different. And so my main question was, do you or anyone have any idea why this kind of much more estuarine sites would necessarily have slower growth? And then you've also just mentioned the fact that it has considerably more take. And is there any evidence then to say, if we've got a long-term higher take of the same population but in one area, whether we're essentially pushing that population for slower growth?
Good, very good question. These are things we still need to figure out. I think there is some work done by Jack Emerson somewhere about whelk populations, possibly to do with either temperature or estuarine environments that affect growth. I couldn't find anything in terms of just looking at sea surface temperatures differences, in terms of days, as to why there would be such a difference between Kent and Essex. I wonder whether there's maybe slightly different ground conditions. I don't know. It's all up for a bit of a debate on that front. But I do know that ground in Kent has historically, way back when, there are reports from over 100 years ago where they were fishing whelks from that ground. It is just historically a very productive area for that particular stock. Again, a good research project possibly.
Thanks.
Thank you, Annabelle. Natalie, did you want to come in on that too?
Yeah, I will do. I think there's two I think a lot more research needs to be done on growth, but I think temperature probably does have a role to play, but I don't think it's sort of necessarily absolute temperatures. I think it might be extremes. So I think when you get slightly shallower and maybe estuarine conditions, you're going to get potentially more extremes of cold and warm. And then also it's the interesting stuff, the work that we've done with Hannah Fennell on the questionnaire, that salinity is having an effect as well. So I think it's a really interesting piece of research that needs to be done. And I think there's lots of bits that have been done and it's about bringing them together. So hopefully over the next year or so, all those sort of threads might start to come together a bit. But I think it probably is a mixture of temperature and salinity. But we've also been talking about sort of food availability and stuff as well. So I don't think we can answer that yet, but it's in the process, hopefully.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, a key question to look forward for on future research. So we have a question next from Tim Ferrero about fishing efforts and affecting size at maturity. So Tim, over to you.
Hi, I think it's just a sort of a general question, really. And it's a bit of a double whammy as well. Coming from the fact that, where I am on the Solent, it seems that we have whelks that mature rather small, and there's a history of quite a lot of exploitation. So I wonder is there any evidence that fishing effort reduces size at maturity? Correspondingly, any evidence that size at maturity actually bounces back? I believe it can be slow in fish, for example. And also, what do we know about the relative importance of large individuals in terms of their brood size and their importance to recruitment?
Thanks, Tim. Would anyone like to come in on that?
Natalie? Firstly, if you like. I think getting direct evidence at this point of, yes, fishing effort has been the cause of these smaller size of maturities. I don't think there is the evidence to say that. However, obviously there are theoretical models that suggest if you are fishing at a size that's below the sort of average size at maturity, you're going to selectively fish for those animals that grow in a certain way, and you can lower the minimum landing size. So theoretically, I think it's possible. I don't think on invertebrates in general, and certainly I don't know of anything on whelk that looks at how quickly they respond, but it is, I would imagine it would likely to be fairly slow, because obviously you've got to start to build up that genetic pool again. So it's not going to happen in just sort of one generation, for example. So yeah, I guess that's, I don't know of any research into it myself. And I've forgotten the second half of the question.
Sorry, that was
oh, I know. It's like fecundity for big, like mega spawners.
Yeah.
So there's not a huge amount of work done on fecundity, as far as I'm aware. There's been some in Sweden, and I think, am I right in thinking there's been some down in Kent Way historically? I can't, maybe in the Thames, like years and years ago. Anyway, it does look like the larger females probably do have a larger reproductive output, but it's not actually as simple, because whelk have this, they have the egg mass, and then within each little capsule there's multiple eggs and embryos, and some of those are actually kind of what they call nurse embryos. So you generally, out of each capsule, you'll maybe only get one or two that mature, because they eat the others that are in there. It's pretty gross. So it's not just a case, you can't take, for example, the ovary egg mass and determine the output. So you have to collect egg masses, and then of course you don't know what size animal the egg masses come from. So it's it's not as straightforward as it would be in crabs and lobsters to do fecundity, but a few places have done it, and it does look like it increases with size.
I just say as well, sorry, just about the recruitment overfishing. Obviously that is a potential. I think it's very hard to disentangle it from the fact that we know now there are latitudinal trends in potential size at maturity, and also obviously, like we've just said, in Kent and Essex, you know, that patch of whelks in Kent is reaching size at maturity larger, bizarrely, but under more pressure than ones that are closer to it. So I wouldn't know. Yeah, you'd have to possibly study a stock on its own to have a look at that, rather than the information we've currently got.
Thanks, Bea. Very interesting. Okay, we've got one more question at the moment, but if there are any last minute questions, do feel free to pop them in as well. This is Robert Wakeford from MRAG. So Robert, do feel free to speak.
All right, it's just a question for Annabelle. It was in one of your last slides regarding Northwestern IFCA. So there was obviously some of the changes that have recently been applied for the management, and you've increased the size of the riddle, etc., to sort of sort for larger animals. But in one of the last slides, you showed the minimum size, but also a maximum size of animals. And it wasn't quite sure, I might have missed something, apologies, but sort of what the premises was of setting the larger maximum size, and potentially how you might go about enforcing that.
Sorry, was this for Northwest IFCA or the Kent one?
The Northwest. I think it was the Northwest. I didn't quite.
We set a maximum and minimum size. Is that what you're saying?
In one of the slides, it tends to suggest.
Been unclear. Sorry. So we're starting off as minimum size at 55 when it was 45, but it will go up to 75 over 3 years, so incrementally, and that will be our limit. Does that make sense?
It does. Okay,
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification.
Sorry, I might have if I've put the 2 in, it might look like I've got I've banded it, but it's not.
Okay, no worries. Thank you.
Grand. Thank you very much, Annabelle. So, I think we've got one more question that's just popped up from Thomas Cameron. So, Thomas, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. Question to all speakers. So, and apologies if I've missed this. I missed the first half of the symposium today. A lot of the data that's been presented are about landings, and that's our metric. That's the metric that's used. So, and this is a bit of a leading question, but how concerned are we, or rather, what actions are we taking when towards fisheries independent assessments for whelks? If landings are a metric, but landings are actually from baited traps and whelks are seasonally aggregated inshore, do we actually have any data on whelk population sizes?
Thank you, Thomas. So that's open to everyone who wants to come in. Natalie, perhaps.
I probably need to come in on this again. Okay, so yeah, this is where I just introduced myself. Thomas, you probably missed me first. I work at Bangor University, and I've been working with Welsh Government on their Sustainable Whelk Fisheries Plan. So it's a really big question, and we've looked at different ways of undertaking a fishery independent study, and they've all got pros, they've all got cons, and it's really not straightforward, like you say, about baited pots. So at the moment, what we're trying to understand is how do different approaches, such as a baited underwater camera or baited pots, landings, how do they actually relate to density that's on the ground? So we're using a microcapture study to try and estimate density at different locations and then deploying different survey methods. So we're really at the beginning of that, and I think we're hoping to find, we may find that none of them have absolutely any relationship to what the density is on the ground, and the whelk are just doing some strange things. But we're hopeful that this will be the start, and then of course we need to start to bring in more environmental parameters. Yeah, I think it's going to be, it's not straightforward. Any pot-based surveys for any species is really, really tricky. So I think all I can say is hopefully we'll continue this research journey and try and come up with some independent survey. The only other thing I can say is when we are doing pot-based surveys at the moment, we are trying to spread out a little bit from key fishing grounds. So, for example, there isn't any fishery, particularly in Swansea Bay anymore due to the MLS, but we have just conducted a survey there. We're trying to engage with some more offshore fishermen as well to try and understand more offshore sites. And then there's some fishermen where we are reimbursing them so that we can say, right, I want you to take me to your normal fishing ground, but also could we go over there where you don't normally fish, so we can start to see, you don't fish there because there's no whelk at all, or is it just because they're lower densities? So we are using pot-based surveys, a lot of work to do, but hopefully we're trying to address some of those issues.
Thank you.
Don't know what anybody else is doing.
Thanks, Natalie. Does anyone else want to come in on that before we move on? All right, okay, well, that brings us to the end of the Q&A session, but there's plenty of time left to engage because we're now moving on to the open forum, which is a chance for more free-flowing discussions between anybody in attendance today, basically. So yeah, we want to hear your thoughts on anything that's been raised today or anything going forwards. And we'll kick this off by just having a quick look at the results of the poll, which I believe you should be able to see on your screens very shortly. Yeah, the results of the poll are basically that in terms of being engaged in development of the Whelk Fisheries Management Plan going forwards, online webinar updates are the most popular by a decent percentage. And so good to hear some confirmation that today's event is a useful format. That's followed up by communications from the Whelk Management Group, and a few people have also expressed an interest in regional in-person events as well. So to kick us off on that front, is there anyone that would like to speak on how they find engagement on topics such as this most interesting? And this is open to all stakeholders, so as well as the academics and the IFCAs we've heard from today. If you're a fisherman or involved in the fishing industry, please do feel free to come in and use this as an opportunity to engage. Is there anyone in the audience at the moment who would like to come in on that front? If you would like to come in, you should see a little raise hand button towards the bottom of your screen, I believe, and that will flag you to the top of my screen. Hi, Sam, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jacob. I just wanted to ask if I spoke to a fisherman earlier, Clive Mills, and he had some really important points to share. So I don't know whether he's still on the call now, but it'd be great to hear from him from his particular perspective.
Thanks, Sam. We don't see him on the call just at the moment, unless he's under a different name, which is possible. But we'll definitely keep an eye out for him.
If there are no further kind of input, I just think everyone's getting quite envious of the sunshine outside their windows. Perhaps we should just move on to some closing remarks.
Absolutely. Yeah, any questions that do come in, we can make sure they get sent to the relevant people after the event. So that's absolutely fine if none are springing to mind just at the moment. So yeah, back over to you, Sam.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Jacob, for chairing that, and Morven, and for all our speakers in that last session, and everyone for raising some really excellent questions. I think it's fair to say that there's a great deal more to discuss, but I think for me that the really excellent presentations today have highlighted a number of important points. Firstly, there's no doubt this is a really important fishery around the entire UK coast, and one therefore that we really need to make great efforts to safeguard for the long term and for those fishing communities that depend upon it. Also, I think some of the research presentations really sort of explained very well how challenging and complex some of the considerations are for assessing stock status and size of maturity, but there's clearly a lot of really good work happening in different institutes and different regions of the country which are looking at that. And something else was there was reference to adaptive management a few times, which was really good to hear. And I think it's particularly pertinent to this fishery, and not just adaptive in terms of time, but also regionally flexible management measures are needed, and that these are being informed by the local evidence and research on populations, some of which clearly needs to be done at a pretty small scale. So a lot of effort clearly needs to go into the evidence base and the research and science behind formulating effective management measures at appropriate scale. I think one of the other things that I noted was really just the vital role of the Whelk Management Group and the Whelk Working Group in sharing knowledge, engaging stakeholders in the development of the Whelk Fisheries Management Plan for England, and the vital role of local fishermen in inputting to that knowledge, that research, and informing that management. And we hope that that can perhaps, following on from this and all the work that the Whelk Management Group will be doing, we'll really see that come to the fore. There's possibly some issues that maybe only been touched upon today, but are worthy of further discussion, including the impact of climate change and other environmental factors, and also the management options for dealing with nomadic vessels and gear conflict, which we didn't really have time to explore so much today. So really on to next steps. So you can review that wealth of information that was shared today. The event's been recorded and we'll be circulating a link to that very shortly, probably within the next week. And then maybe in a couple of months' time, we'll be publishing the proceedings report, which will summarise the symposium presentations. And we're also including in that some abstracts from some of the research where the researchers were out doing that research and were unable to present today. So if anyone that's listening was unable to present but has some research or work that they've done which they'd like to share, please do get in touch and we can try and make sure we include that in those symposium proceedings. And as Lewis described, Seafish and the Whelk Management Group will be undertaking significant work over the next 18 months to develop that fisheries management plan ahead of the public consultation in, I think it was summer next year or early spring next year. And as Lewis mentioned, you can contact him directly if you'd like further information about how to input to that. Really, stakeholder engagement is absolutely key to all of this. And so it's been really useful, and thank you for expressing your preferences for how you'd like to be kept informed. And I think that'll be taken on board and perhaps sort of instigate the development and establishment of a number of future webinars as well. So finally, just like to extend a huge thank you to all of our speakers today for sharing their insights and experience and really excellent presentations. I learned so much from it. I hope everyone else did as well. And thanks to Jacob, Becky and Paul from Mindfully Wild Communications and Amy for all their support in making the event run so smoothly. So we hope you all enjoyed the event, maybe learned something new. I know I certainly did, and that you'll continue to actively engage and input to the research, the Whelk Fisheries Management Plan as it develops over the next 18 months and ensure that we can safeguard this very important fishery for the long term. So thank you very much, everybody, for participation and engagement today. And I hope you have a really good evening. Enjoy the sunshine.